All right. So I'd like to say that I'm very grateful for this opportunity because I am an historian by training, and I'm looking forward to learn from you who are more expert than me in philosophy of science, and especially with Feyerabend, which, as you will see, I found very inspirational for my research. And tonight, I'm going to talk about Claudius Ptolemy, this 2nd century CE astronomer, scientist, starting from some considerations I read in Against Method, especially in chapter 14, and in an essay by Bardi from the volume Interpreting Feyerabend in 2021. And then I will go on by explaining why I think that it's safe to say that Ptolemy goes against method. And then I will conclude by articulating the examination of Ptolemy in a perspective of scientific pluralism. So these are my 3 sections of the talk I'm going to start. And so here it's more than 10:30 p.m. from where I'm talking, and if sometime I'm slow or I'm not very brilliant, please bear with me. Is that after 9 p.m. sometimes it's not easy to be intelligent. As I said, the protagonist of this talk is Ptolemy, and from 2nd century CE, who wrote one of the most important systematical mathematical treatise on astronomy for ancient astronomy before Copernicus and Newton and the other important figures of this branch of science. And we will look at, from a philosophical perspective, at the models that he employs with geometrical constructions, and especially with the epicycles, the eccentrics, and the equants. But I will not go into geometrical details. But I want to just mention them because in the historiography of science and in some philosophical literature, you find these models mentioned in the discussions about instrumentalism and realism in science. And as many of you know, these are mentioned in Against Method, especially in chapter 14. In that section of Against Method, Feyerabend is articulating his view on the discussions that were happening in 16th and 17th century astronomy, and he's basically arguing against the theory of paradigm shift in a way, because he points out the similarity between the Copernican and Ptolemaic systems, and is showing how Galileo, in his defense of Copernicanism, is adopting a lot of rhetoric, and it's not useful to see a clear rupture between Ptolemy and Copernicus, because Copernicus is emulating the Ptolemaic system. There is just a shift in the geometry, but in the way he's doing mathematical astronomy is basically the same. These topics have been reprised in 2021 by Bardi in his discussion of theoretical pluralism in Feyerabend, and we will see that were useful for my research. As I read chapter 14, I thought, well, here there are some foundational problems at stake, and I found that there was an article in 2017 that was questioning what kind of axioms Ptolemy is employing. And he has to deal, like all ancient astronomers, with the problem of how to account for the celestial motions according to uniform and circular motion. But given this axiom, or in Greek, archai, are they immutable or adaptable to circumstances that observations give to us? And connected to the problems of axioms is the term hypothesis, which in the original Greek does not correspond to what we mean with model in science. The ancient astronomers, both Ptolemy and Copernicus, had the task to save the phenomena. So they were setting astronomical hypotheses, and if these were verified with calculations, then they were considered to be physically real, not just mathematically. And the Ptolemaic system, in this perspective, is a reaction towards the introduction of Babylonian astronomy in the 2nd century CE. So, given all these premises, can we say that Ptolemy is practicing a kind of anything goes? Well, as we know, in pluralism, we can examine a coexistence of heterogeneous representations in scientific practice. And in the history of astronomy, from the evidence, from the sources we have, there are different theories and models to deal with the same group of problems. And if we re-examine the very sources of Ptolemy, how his methodology works and how he's dealing with the problem of experience, how is he mentioning the role of instrumentation in astronomy, I think that I can challenge some traditional narratives that have been very successful in the historiography of science. And for this challenge, the literature in philosophy of science I've read is very helpful. So the big question, is Ptolemy against method? To be brief, yes. If we take a summary look to historiography of science, I think that we can hear a chorus of people saying that Ptolemy is not taking care of physical reality. He is violating his same principles with the introduction of the equant. At the beginning of his system, he's saying that there is a center for the motion of the sun, but sometimes we have to postulate another center, which to him is physically real. But when it comes to the planets, he introduces a third point, which sometimes has to act as the center for the motions. So many scholars after him, and maybe in his own time, criticized him because they said this is impossible, it's not physically provable. So Ptolemy is not just going against Aristotle, which was postulating an unique center for all the motion of the planets and the spheres, but he's going against himself. So twice. So he's not following the right method as proposed by Aristotle with homocentrism. His models are not physically real. And third, Ptolemy thinks that mathematics is superior to natural philosophy or physics. So in this sense, he goes against the authority of the time, Aristotle. So in this sense, I think after reading Feyerabend, Ptolemy goes against method. By saying this, I want to stress on the fact that after the 2nd century, after late antiquity, we see an emergence of a group of scholars creating an orthodoxy. saying that we should deal with astronomy in just an Aristotelian way, and who goes against him would not have anything useful. Nothing good can come out of this. But, well, there are many different voices. One of them is Ptolemy. And so he's, in his system, in the Almagest, Ptolemy, he's using some principles, the archai, but for when it comes to the motion of the planets, he has to adjust them because, as he says, he had to propose new models according to experience, because he has done some observation of his own, and he is reprising also data from the past, but with this is not enough to use the models he used in the previous books. So if we take the literary meaning of this principle, arche, he goes against it. So he's an anarchist. In his own system, we find a trace of scientific anarchism. And the very source of this is the so-called, by historians of science, is called the Introduction of the Equant. By many historical sources, like the pure Aristotelians, this was considered the violation of a principle. But Ptolemy knew that it could be problematic for some of his peers, so he justifies the use of this third center to adjust his hypothesis for the motion of the planets. And in that same passage, he points out the importance of instrumentation in order to make observations and to try to be as precise as possible in astronomical activity. So in this sense, sometimes in Feyerabend or some of his commentators, we find that Tycho Brahe is the first who introduced instrumentation as something significant in the history of astronomy, but I would not take this figure as a rupture between modern and ancient science. And when I say Ptolemy as a scientific anarchist or someone who goes against method, I could also locate this historically, because there is evidence of a group of historians going against, criticizing Ptolemy, because he does not stick to the way Aristotle is interpreting the basic principle, the basic axiom of uniform and circular motion in astronomy. And one of the most important passages for what I'm articulating, it could be found in the Almagest, the most important work of Ptolemy, Book 9, Chapter 2, in which it's a very long passage. I can just summarize it here, and we will find that he's an advocate of empiricism when he's dealing with the principle of uniform and circular motion. He is deliberately going against the previous methodology he adopted in the previous books, because he has to adapt according to experience. And not only that, because I'm doing this because I know the subject matter, the planets, that for him are something of a different nature than the objects in the Earth. And then he stresses on the importance of observations which must be put to a test, and then complains about the observations of his predecessors and the achievements of his predecessors, which left him unsatisfied. And he is suggesting that science is a process of trial and error in order to adjust his mathematics to physical reality. So this also goes against those historians who saw Ptolemy as a instrumentalist, as someone who was just dealing with mathematics but didn't care about physical reality. In that same passage, we find a stress on instrumentation, as I mentioned earlier. And then a third element is to consider is that the justification of this third point and the importance of experience and the justification of this new methodology is not really needed. It's likely that already in his time there were different theories and methods concerning astronomy. Therefore, this suggests that it's correct, it's safe to think this scenario of astronomy in late antiquity as a plural scenario. So the importance of the debates about the uniform and circular motion in astronomy, which is existing before Ptolemy and will continue after him till the major innovations with Copernicus, and then later with Brahe, with Kepler, Newton, etc. And these debates were not just concerning the geometry, but also the foundations. Earlier I mentioned that Ptolemy is a mathematical realist. He thinks that it is the mathematics due to its object of study which is superior to physics, because physics, or better, natural philosophy, deals with corruptible objects. So it cannot give you the same degree of knowledge as astronomy, which is based on mathematics. So this is a plural scenario before Copernicus, and this goes against the picture of Ptolemy as a bad example of scientist, because we find all the elements which makes him a good scientist, actually. And all these elements could be useful to reconsider a huge part of the history of astronomy, at least from the 2nd century till the 16th, and to reconsider some authorities in the history of science, like Noel Swerdlow from Chicago University, that he wrote, for example, although he considers Ptolemy a scientist, he wrote that he had established these hypotheses, like how to account for the motion of the sun and for the planets with different methodologies, once and for all. Then the observation showed that they were indubitably correct, and that unlike parameters, which could later be improved, no one would ever have to go through the work of justifying these hypotheses. Well, from what I read in the Almagest, I don't agree with this view, because it is with reading the justification of the introduction of the equant that we find a scholar who is clearly in favor of empiricism and of a plural methodology in his own work. So this is something which to me is similar to the anything goes. And I would like to hear your opinion on this. So with my work in progress, I'm trying to see Ptolemy and the history of astronomy before Copernicus with the lenses of pluralism. And this challenges not the notion that the equant violates a principle, and highlights the existence of a debate of people talking to each other and not just sticking to some principle because they consider it as an authority, like the Aristotelian one, which becomes authoritative but much later, at least in the 6th century. And so how I'm going to do this task to account for pluralism in this in the centuries before Copernicus? Well, after reading the essay of Bradbury, I found that he is considering different theories by Ptolemy, Copernicus, Brahe, Ursus. So there is a gap between the 16th century and what comes earlier. So I'm trying to have a huge spectrum of authors who have challenged the problems that we find in Ptolemy and Aristotle, both from Christian, Islamic, and Jewish cultures, for example, Averroists and Averroists, or Arbitrugis, who introduces the orbits in the form of spirals, and then Levi Ben Gershon or Ali Kushchi. And in these authors, we find both theoretical and methodological pluralism, because we have, of course, a geocentric universe, but thought in different ways. For example, with Averroes and the Averroists, they think about it in a physical way. So it's physics that should orient the mathematics and not the other way around as in Ptolemy. But then when dealing with the planets, Albitrugi has to introduce a new point for the center of the spheres, which is similar to the equant. So this is something which goes in favor of a methodological pluralism. Or there is a very interesting figure from 13th, 14th century France, Levi Ben Gershon, who reacts to the problem of astronomy as a modern scientist. He's, like Ptolemy, stresses on the importance of undertake your own observation, use your own instruments, and for example, in one of his works, the Wars of the Lord, he wrote, "We did not find among our predecessors from Ptolemy to the present day observations that are helpful for this investigation except our own." So you should find out for yourself. And with Gersonides and other scholars, I think I could fill the gap I found by reading Brad Ray's essay. And well, with these points of Gersonides, I could add, just to conclude, that in this concern, I have to act like an historian. I don't think philosophy is enough, because there is a problem of transmission of manuscripts. We don't know what kind of Ptolemy Gersonides and the Averroists were reading. Maybe they missed some chapters, like the one in which Ptolemy is justifying the introduction of a third point of a new methodology. But this is not clear, and it's something I have to explore more deeply. But in my last slide, I want to I'm happy to share with you that reading Against Method was inspirational for this study. And what I want to do with my work is to see the equant problem in a pluralistic perspective, because I think I can give another interpretation of the history of ancient astronomy. So I could give materials for an important historiographical revision, which can trace some cases of anything goes before what is usually analyzed by Feyerabend and contemporary philosophers of science. And I'm looking forward to hear your comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Alberto. Fascinating paper. Looks like we have some questions. Oh, Mateo's hand is stuck up. Jamie?
Cool. Thank you so much for your talk, Alberto. That was really, really fascinating. And it's also really refreshing hearing from somebody who's actually read Ptolemy, which even amongst philosophers of science can be a bit rare. So my question has to do with what the reconstruction of Ptolemy as an anarchist is kind of looking like. So like one part of, or like the kind of implicit message that I was taking was, you know, Ptolemy takes one method, he applies it to something, and then he says, and then we move on to something different. He's like, well, things are different here, so I'm going to drop that old method. I'm going to pick up this new one. In which case he looks something like a kind of an opportunist in Feyerabend's sense. And I'm wondering, is that the right way to think about Ptolemy on your account? Or is there also cases where Ptolemy seems to like, you know, drop a methodological or theoretical presupposition and there's not really a clear reason why he does it, and he just kind of, you know, he's maybe being a little bit more playful or experimental in that kind of sense. So I'm just curious about, yeah, is there room for both of these in your interpretation, or is it more the former? What are your thoughts?
Thanks. Well, I think there is room to talk about opportunism, but not with a negative connotation. Perhaps I think we can label the introduction of the equant, so a different method to deal with the motion of the planets, respecting the principle of uniform circular motion as an ad hoc hypothesis. So in the same work, the Almagest, we find different methods in order to deal with the same problem. So how to deal with apparently irregular motions in a regular way. So along this path, Ptolemy is, I would say, is pretty playful, as you used the word. I think that in the scenario of ancient astronomers, he's pretty playful. He gives justification of what he's doing. He gives materials to a careful reader to notice, not just mathematically, but philosophically, why he's introducing new elements to play with astronomy. In fact, the novelty of Copernicus was possible because he understood this playfulness, in my opinion. So the major shift of Copernicus, of putting the sun next to the center of the universe, is just because he understood Ptolemy as someone playful and not as someone who should be respected as a sacred authority.
That's really cool. There's like kind of you know, different readings about what it is to be an anarchist for Feyerabend, and it seems like Ptolemy's kind of fitting all of the models of anarchism that Feyerabend. So that's really, really cool. Thank you.
Thanks.
Just to follow up on Jamie's question a little bit, so the equant is being brought up within the kind of epicycle deference system of Ptolemy. So it's not exactly clear to me, first of all, why we're not just regarding this as some kind of ad hoc hypothesis or some kind of auxiliary hypotheses that Ptolemy adds in here. And I guess, secondly, to put this in a form of a question, so you're kind of claiming that Ptolemy is kind of, he's a mathematical realist in some sense. Like, as long as the kind of mathematical structures can kind of save the phenomena in some kind of broad way, that's all he cares about. So maybe you could say a little bit just to clarify this distinction between physical realism versus mathematical realism, because it seems to me they're all trying to coordinate it with the empirical phenomena. But I'll just invite you to kind of clarify that question maybe and push on why we should see this as kind of counter-induction, a la Feyerabend.
All right. Throughout antiquity and late antiquity at least in Europe and the Middle East, we have sources who are pointing to a debate about the foundation of astronomy, in the sense is astronomy informed by mathematics or natural philosophy. Ptolemy thinks that it's mathematics as superior to natural philosophy because it's mathematics dealing with numbers, deals with a reality which is superior to the corruptible objects of the Earth. The nature of the planets is not as equal as the one in the Earth. They are of a superior nature. In this, he is reprising Aristotle. They are made of the fifth element. So there are still elements of change because they move, but we can deal with them with the abstract properties of numbers. So we deal with something in change, but if we deal it with numbers, we have something stable. So in this sense, these elements give us a true knowledge. So in this sense, if to Ptolemy, if our observations and our theory, our hypothesis will be coherent, like when we verify an eclipses or we verify the position of a planet, then because of the numbers, this is physically real. Because the other way around to him could not make sense because of the object that natural philosophy is studying. But to Aristotle and the others, this was not the case. So on these grounds, the introduction of another center to deal with the motion of the planets, because Ptolemy thought that we could try to employ both the eccentric and the epicycle hypothesis to deal with them, but it was not in accordance to what he was experiences with his own observation and with the observations from the past. So mathematically it was not coherent. Therefore, he feels justified to introduce a new geometrical model which would guarantee his mathematics to be real. And if this happens, this coincides with physics.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful. Jordi, did you have a question?
Yes, a question and a comment. The question has to do with mathematics, because what I found interesting and intriguing is to get a sense for whether he's thinking in terms of geometry or numbers. And somehow I assumed that it was mathematics meant geometry, not numbers. And then I became further intrigued when then you mentioned mathematical realism about it, because I wasn't clear whether mathematical realism was realism about abstract entities that mathematics describe at the level of numbers, or it's realism in the theoretical realism of the application of geometry, that the geometrical features, even quantitative features, are in nature. These are different kinds of realism. And I wasn't sure whether you were going to say that one realism supports the other, or it's only one or the other. Could you clarify that? But the other thing I was going to say, before I forget, is that this is a very good line of argument, in the sense that many things we've seen so far in these talks is the illustration of Feyerabend's views in the context of scientific practice. But in this case, you're actually using Feyerabend's views to actually, historiographically, to do the history in a sense, to actually do better history. It seemed to me.
Well, thanks, Jordi. The mathematical realism is at least twofold in Ptolemy. When he speaks of it like a philosopher, he thinks that numbers are real entities. So he's a Platonist in that sense.
Okay.
But when he introduces the geometrical models, he is dealing with that in a quantitative way.
And are the two connected? Is Platonism relevant to the application of the numbers for him?
Yes, to him is relevant, yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Oh, that's very nice.
Yes. I think that Ptolemy is acting like a modern scientist because in all the chapters he's proposing, is doing with the planets quantitatively.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we can give Alberto a hand. We can take a 5-minute break before Juliet gives her talk. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It was very helpful.
Yeah, very good.
Okay.
I used to be Noel Swerdlow's TA at Chicago, and he's obviously brilliant. But what I remember from his class was he would really take down the plagiarists in a way that was probably seen as bullying now.
Yeah,
but...
yeah, he was a very brilliant scholar,
yes.
undoubtedly, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So we're going to reconvene in 5 minutes, and Juliet's going to talk about political theory in Feyerabend.
Eric?
It's just you and me again.
Yeah.
And Jordi's back.
You're back. What happened? I thought you were busy.
Just to tell you, I'm busy, but I can have some breaks. So
you can resist. You couldn't resist.
Yeah, I can't resist.
He saw my pretty face.
Exactly.
I got your email, Eric, but I couldn't. Haven't had time to work on that yesterday and this morning. I taught all the morning, so and this afternoon I have this issue here, so I will find the time to work on that in the evening or most likely tomorrow. So yeah.
I'm not the one putting time pressure on here. I was afraid that Jamie thought he had a letter from 1965 that said happy birthday. That would be a problem.
No, it's not 65. No. It's for the 65th birthday of Feyerabend.
Yeah,
something like that.
Because I had already to adjust that story once now.
Okay. All right then. So I hope I can follow the next one, which seems pretty interesting.
I think that in the last talk, I think he needs to do a little more systematic work distinguishing issues like pluralism, realism, empiricism, and then, or in the chat, as they said, and then start to look was there counterinduction, opportunism, and these more specific variables. But until you have a more fine-grained distinctions and less vague things, it's hard to follow if there's what's really going on.
But I think part of the problem, what complicates the thing further, to add philosophical epicycles, is that many of these terms had already some meaning there, and then like empiricism and so on. So you have to be very careful navigating the use of the labels.
Yeah,
we have to draw these distinctions, which kind of also interesting in a way. The way we these things already had been stabilized as particular perspectives, but in a way that don't quite mean the same thing. So actually, that would be another level that is interesting to add to that analysis.
Yeah, but still would help to understand it.
Yeah. Let me go to the bathroom really quickly, if I can.
Right. And I've thought over the reconstruction you provided yesterday, Eric, and I'm really thinking now that it's most a matter of emphasis. The difference between you had already told me that long ago, but now I can see it more clearly how it is a matter. I mean, of course, when I say that with the explanation reduction, Feyerabend was trying to improve Popper, I mean also that he is criticizing some part of it. And I think you made a good job when you said it's limited validity. So the emphasis, either one puts the emphasis on limited or on validity, one have different, because limited validity means that there's also validity.
Right. Yeah.
Even if it's limited. So I think that
I agree that
I think that my main point is that up to the awakening, let's call it like that, he was still working within that framework of normative epistemology, at least slowly getting away from that, but slowly. At that point, I think he realized that.
Do you think that happened in 65 with Weizsäcker, or does the 65 thing trigger the later epiphany? Are there two epiphanies?
I think that the 65 triggered the later epiphany, and I would also be more precise than that, because we know that in the summer of 1965, Feyerabend was supposed to defend the Popperian position against Kuhn at the Bedford colloquium, and he didn't participate because he was hospitalized. And while he was hospitalized, he read books on the history of science, and I think that was the starting point of the whole process. Then with the Weizsäcker, he had a first shock, let's call it like that, and this triggered some ruminations that led to the 1967. Also with the Lakatos lectures at the LSE, when he says, "I heard the humor, and nothing was, everything was wrong or nothing was correct." And that was so there are a series of.
Well, that's the epiphany in 67 in December, right?
Yeah, that one. Yeah.
So you would agree with me that he starts to criticize Popper openly first time in 62. Yeah, but
maybe with the openly we need to be, because if he would been as explicit as he was with Hempel and Nagel, well, we wouldn't be discussing. Of course.
Yeah, but that would have also defeated the purpose of this being his breakout paper with a big reveal.
Sorry?
If he had put it as explicitly as with Hempel and Nagel, he wouldn't have had this big reveal on coming out from under my mentor's shadow effect. He was trying to step out from under Popper's shadow by putting it as the big main conclusion in a reveal. You have to look at the structure of the argument. I mean, it's the main conclusion. My boss's account doesn't work.
Gotta go. I'll get back to you soon.
Yeah.
And Eric, I thought it was very kind of eloquent how you're like ERE. It's like, well, it's an argument against Hempel, Nagel, and then Popper. But with the last E with empiricism, isn't the last E Carnap? Like he's the one getting the brunt of the explicit arguments in that paper, right? Is it?
But Carnap is criticized already in the first E together with Hempel. So if you look at the Carnap of criticism, it's the first E. It's already on page whatever. It's in the first section, the second section of criticism after the introduction. And then, but the whole time he says, at the end of the paper, I'm going to show you this applies to empiricism more generally. And you keep wondering, who's he going to do? Who's that? Yeah. And then the main conclusion is Popper's empiricism doesn't work.
Okay, I'm gonna have to reread this. Yeah,
I don't think that
I like that way you framed it, though. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but of course, he does criticize Carnap too, and so.
Yeah, quite consistently through the 60s. Juliet, are you going to be using slides?
Yeah. Should I share my screen?
Yeah, share your screen. Get us all set up.
Okay. Is that working?
Oh yeah, perfect. All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Juliet Paiva at the University of Oxford. And yeah, I'll just turn it over to you, Juliet.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so just a brief disclaimer that I am a political theorist by training and not nearly as knowledgeable about Feyerabend as the rest of you, but I hope my presentation will still show how Feyerabend's thought could potentially help us to theorize about politics. So please enjoy. Should our inquiries aim at truth? In the natural sciences, the answer to this question is relatively straightforward. The goal of science broadly is to discover the truth about the natural world. Improving epistemic understanding seems to be the aim of most forms of inquiry that guide human life. It might seem obvious then, when addressing questions of political and social life, we must strive to discover the truth behind these questions. However, the mainstream methodology in analytic political philosophy calls for the dismissal of so-called truth talk. This widespread position of agnosticism concerning the truth value of moral and political claims can be traced to one of the most prominent political theorists of the 20th century, John Rawls, whose explicit avoidance of the notion of truth has become the dominant approach in contemporary analytic political theory. Rawls's methodology distinguishes political philosophy from other branches of philosophy by centralizing its mode of theorizing against a background of pluralism. Rawls develops these ideas about how pluralism necessitates the dismissal of truth, primarily in his later works, including Political Liberalism, where he defines society as being in a state of reasonable pluralism when there is a diversity of perfectly reasonable, comprehensive doctrines. In reasonably pluralistic societies, different individuals hold conflicting moral and metaphysical views, including those on the objective status of what is true and what doctrines and beliefs count as true. Political theory is uniquely situated to defend normative and evaluative principles under these conditions, which entails certain methodological limitations. According to Rawls, one cannot operate under the assumption that among a plurality of different reasonable views, there is a single independently correct one. Theories of politics should be, at least in principle, acceptable to all members of the society in which the theory is applied. Individuals who find the theory acceptable hold differing and conflicting comprehensive doctrines, and since acceptability in society characterizes the method of political justification, and political societies are inherently pluralistic, political theorists following Rawls avoid subjects that lead to disagreement, casting away epistemological notions like truth entirely. Given the fact of reasonable pluralism, the Rawlsian branch of political theory sees truth and other epistemological concepts as an obstacle to theorizing that must be cast aside. However, does pluralism necessarily entail this truth value agnosticism? Some theorists criticize the Rawlsian negligence of truth, labeled epistemic abstinence, but in doing so, relinquish the unique significance of pluralism for political theory. Can both pluralism's centrality to political life and the aim of truth be kept in sight? Perhaps surprisingly, one thinker who also considers the complex relationship between pluralism and pursuits of knowledge is also notorious for his controversial ideas about scientific method, but also, as we heard in John's presentation on Thursday, pluralism in society too can really be part of what we think of as Feyerabend's kind of contribution. In Against Method and Other Works, Feyerabend defends epistemological anarchism, which values a proliferation of views and methods. He takes inspiration from John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty and the position that, quote, pluralism is supposed to lead to truth. Although Feyerabend is not a political theorist and his insights may not directly apply to political questions, his view offers a fruitful comparison to the stance of epistemic abstinence in political theory. Rawls's position implies that truth inhibits method, whereas Feyerabend explores how method can inhibit truth. Reviewing Rawls's epistemic abstinence in light of Feyerabend's insights reveals the complicated interaction between truth and pluralism in society. I will now offer a brief overview of the rest of the presentation. First, I'm going to outline Rawlsian epistemic abstinence, consider some of the most prominent critiques against it, and expand on one of them in specific, David Estlund's critique that I believe highlights the limitations of being methodologically avoidant in pluralistic contexts. Next, I turn to Feyerabend, considering his position against method and considering its application to political theory. I will then bring Rawlsian epistemic abstinence and Feyerabend's epistemological anarchism together to consider first the relationship between pluralism and agreement, and second, the relationship between truth and pluralism. Now moving on to John Rawls's epistemic abstinence. In Political Liberalism, Rawls upsets the traditional assumption that philosophy uncovers the truth. Political theory has a uniquely political role, which entails that Rawls's political conception does without the concept of truth. The methodology Rawls and his followers utilize depends intentionally on casting aside certain concepts. The primary reasoning for abandoning truth has to do with assumptions about justification given pluralism. Rawls describes it as a method of avoidance, where he neither affirms nor denies any religious, philosophical, or moral views, including their associated truth status. He considers the aim of his theory to be practical, writing that it presents itself not as a conception of justice that is true, but one that can serve as a basis of informed and willing political agreement. Truth, Rawls fears, would get in the way of his method, would get in the way of practicality because of pluralism. The method of reflective equilibrium is central to Rawls's project and remains dominant in political theory to this day. Reflective equilibrium concerns an interplay between principles and judgments, where the two are brought together through a process of revising the initial principles and/or judgments. It is a three-part process that requires first identifying one's initial beliefs on the relevant question or topic, then second, coming up with an initial set of principles that would account for these beliefs, and finally, engaging in a reflective process that goes back and forth between any conflicting beliefs and principles to bring them into agreement. As a method, there's no guarantee that the agreed upon principles will be true. Instead, it aims for general acceptability. Since the process of reflective equilibrium occurs within political societies and conditions of pluralism entail that separate individuals begin the process with fundamentally different initial beliefs and produce conflicting views through the method, it is not likely to ever lead to a single objective truth. Between people within a pluralistic society, conceptions like the truth of conflicting positions get in the way of reaching agreement and determining justified political principles. Rawls explains the independence of moral theory from epistemology arises from the fact that the procedure of reflective equilibrium does not assume that there is one correct moral conception. The aim here is to characterize a reasonable decision-making procedure that would yield justified results. The scheme of justification that characterizes Rawlsian political theory requires that its principles of justice and constitutional essentials be acceptable to all reasonable points of view within the society it applies. The key characteristic of political societies is pluralism, the fact that a polity is made up of groups and people with diverse practices and beliefs, including some that are inconsistent with each other. Since reflective equilibrium is a method for reaching practical agreement, when applied to political concepts like justice, it purposefully relies on grounds that do not bear on these diverse practices and beliefs that reasonable people could disagree on. Therefore, Rawls's conception of justice purposefully avoids certain types of claims. It's worth noting that Rawls also does not intervene in conceptual arguments about things like the nature of truth, such as contributing to philosophical debates about the status and accessibility of objective truth. Instead, the move to avoid truth claims is entirely practical. Rawls explains, philosophy is the search for truth about an independent metaphysical and moral order cannot, I believe, provide a workable and shared basis for a political conception of justice in a democratic society. Since the method of justification is grounded on reaching agreement, Rawls purposefully leaves out truth for the simple methodological reason that it would get in the way of justifying his theory. Several critics have pushed back against the epistemologically abstinent stance of rejecting certain claims to justify political principles on the basis of social cooperation. Three notable responses to epistemic abstinence come from Joseph Raz, Joshua Cohen, and David Estlin. Although all three make strong arguments for why political theory should make reference to truth and how political liberalism errs by not doing so, Estlin comes closest to identifying it as a problem related to controversial assumptions made about pluralism. Raz, Cohen, and Estlin all share the view that we cannot cleanly disconnect political theorizing from truth. Raz argues that the entire theory of political liberalism is incoherent if it does not put itself forward as true. He thinks the acceptability requirement entails the same thing as each citizen regarding the principles of justice as true. Quote, to recommend a theory of justice as a theory of justice for our societies is to recommend it as a just theory of justice. That is, as a true or reasonable or valid theory of justice. So according to Raz, there can be no justice without truth. So either Rawls's theory is incoherent or it must secretly smuggle in a conception of truth. Cohen similarly takes issue with the purported avoidance of truth in light of including other closely related concepts. Political deliberation includes activities intimately connected to truth, so it is incoherent to completely do away with or replace truth with a less controversial concept like reasonableness. Cohen instead promotes a political conception of truth, which is a minimal notion that would survive disagreement over philosophical concepts. He aims to present a view of truth that suffices for public reasoning and could reasonably be endorsed by adherents of conflicting doctrines. In other words, Cohen modifies Rawls's view to allow citizens to make explicit claims about truth in public reasoning. It is worth noting, however, that Rawls himself does not claim that the concept of truth is unavailable to citizens, only that it's restricted from being used as justification for political principles. While Raz and Cohen's critiques focus on the conceptual necessity of truth for political theory, Estlin questions the broader method of justification through securing agreements in a pluralistic society without recourse to truth. He argues that political liberalism must assert the truth and not merely the reasonableness or acceptability to all reasonable people of its foundational principle, that doctrines are admissible as premises in political justification only if they are acceptable to reasonable citizens. He accepts both the fact of reasonable pluralism and the criterion of legitimacy, that justification requires acceptability by all reasonable points of view, but then suggests that this principle itself must be true to be justified. Estlin draws attention to the methodological core of political liberalism, what counts as successful justification, to argue that the method of justification itself must aspire to truth. Estlin keeps pluralism in sight, but questions the methodological claim that to justify a principle or theory, it must be acceptable to all in a reasonable pluralistic society, of which any truth claim would not be. This insight opens up the possibility of identifying a positive connection between truth and pluralism. If it is true that justification must be in terms that all reasonable people would accept, then Estlin suggests a possible way forward would be to appeal to the epistemic value of that discussion that produces the justification in the first place. Estlin proposes a different way to think about the relationship between truth and pluralism. While Rawls stays firm in the belief that the fact of reasonable pluralism necessitates epistemic abstinence, Estlin raises the question of whether accommodating pluralism necessarily requires abstaining. He offers a reorientation away from the Rawlsian answer. Instead of concepts like truth inhibiting a successful justification because of pluralism, pluralism itself produces epistemically valuable consensus. Now, and in the interest of why we're here, I'll move on from Rawls to a view familiar to all of you about how to theorize under conditions of pluralism. The central slogan of Feyerabend's epistemological anarchism, anything goes, encompasses the belief that there should not be a single universal method in science. What makes the position anarchic is the denial of entrenched systems of rules and constraints. Anything goes was not a positive proposal for complete anarchy, but instead the provocative conclusion of a reductio ad absurdum. Feyerabend intended to make an imminent criticism and aimed to show that if we accept the view that there are methodological principles that are universally valid, the only one will be that anything goes. Feyerabend explains, anything goes does not express any conviction of mine. It is a jocular summary of the predicament of the rationalist. Therefore, his defense of a wide range of eccentric and controversial beliefs can be understood in the context of his view of theoretical pluralism. Feyerabend takes inspiration from John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty to defend the epistemic value of pluralism. Elizabeth Lloyd offers a compelling study of Feyerabend's relationship to Mill, in which she argues that Feyerabend genuinely endorsed Mill's claim that pluralism leads to truth. Feyerabend acknowledges that the idea that a pluralistic methodology is necessary for both the advancement of knowledge and for the development of individuality has been discussed by J.S. Mill. Both thinkers agree that society is characterized by pluralism and believe that there is something epistemically harmful about trying to constrain this plurality of ideas and practices, and something valuable produced through that pluralism. Lloyd argues that Feyerabend accepts a central idea in Mill's essay, that exposure to falsehoods is epistemically beneficial. Mill warns of the harm that restricting opinions has to society. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. Champions of dissenting opinions play an invaluable role in discovering truth, according to Mill, and Feyerabend's position can be read as an attempt to play this role. Feyerabend argues that if we are restricted to one universal method that purports to be the best or the truth, it would impede the overarching goal of scientific inquiry, advancing knowledge. He writes, the only way of arriving at a useful judgment of what is supposed to be the truth, or the correct procedure, is to become acquainted with the widest possible range of alternatives. Importantly for Feyerabend and Mill, we do not reach the truth and then stop. The process of interrogating our findings never ceases, and any prolonged stability indicates failure. Therefore, truth is not something we can ever fully grasp onto or claim to definitively hold, and it is a methodological failure to think otherwise. Instead, truth is forever postponed, but must remain theoretically central. Truth should aim and guide inquiry because it benefits society to do so. Feyerabend's epistemological anarchy has fundamentally humanitarian aims and sees the pluralistic method as something that will increase liberty and lead to a full and rewarding life. Here we see the idea that the pursuit of truth is good for humanity, and that recognizes the value of pluralism. He explains that proliferation is introduced as the solution to a problem of life. How can we achieve full consciousness? How can we learn what we are capable of doing? How can we increase our freedom? Feyerabend identifies a connection between pluralism and progress, where the pluralism characteristic of society necessitates a pluralistic method. However, Feyerabend is not a political theorist, and it remains unclear how his insights in against method apply to theorizing about politics. I argue that it is not too much of a stretch and is indeed useful to consider political theorizing through a Feyerabendian lens for two reasons. First, Feyerabend's epistemological anarchism took inspiration from a political philosopher in the first place. Feyerabend took Mill's idea of tolerating pluralism in a liberal democratic society and applied it to the philosophy of science. Appropriating epistemological anarchism for questions of political and social significance remains close to the original concept derived from Mill. The second reason to apply epistemological anarchism to political theory is that it demonstrates a way to theorize against the background of pluralism. The interaction of pluralism and politics differentiates political theory from closely related fields like moral philosophy. Political theory addresses entrenched political and social problems that directly bear on the lives of people with diverse viewpoints. Feyerabend's view makes this condition of potential strength rather than a detriment to theorizing about politics. To universally apply any one method would mean potentially overlooking the epistemically valuable diversity of viewpoints and approaches in society. Even a method that removes certain concepts from the conversation in the first place still runs awry in this way. Truth is not something ever definitively reached, but instead operates as a North Star that theorizing amidst pluralism aims towards. Feyerabend's view suggests that pluralism is not a condition that political theorists must theorize despite, but the constituting feature of political and social life. Rawls's epistemic abstinence and Feyerabend's epistemological anarchism both respond to the fact of pluralism and similar concerns about intolerance, but end up with sharply distinct views. Both thinkers see pluralism as a condition that complicates theorizing, but also one that centrally constitutes it. For Rawls, the fact of pluralism is a condition that we must get around to reach rational agreement on political values. By contrast, Feyerabend sees any single methodology that aims to circumvent the fact of pluralism as harmful to progress. It is difficult to offer a direct comparison of the two since Rawls considers the pluralism among people in liberal democratic societies, while Feyerabend, at least in against method, speaks to scientific pluralism between different methods and theories. Still, applying Feyerabend's position to politics and contrasting it to Rawls reveals how their differing views on pluralism and whether it has any inherent value shapes each of their views. The central difference between the approaches is a matter of whether they have a generally optimistic or pessimistic view of the ability to reach agreement under pluralistic conditions. Rawls has a pessimistic view of the potential for people to agree about controversial topics in a pluralistic society, a position that directly shapes his methodology because he believes justification requires general acceptability. Feyerabend, in comparison, posits an optimistic Millian view of the epistemic value of pluralism. While other apparent differences, such as Rawls's addition of the reasonable, may not be too far from Feyerabend's approach to pluralism, the primary difference between the two is whether they think pluralism inhibits agreement or not. A main issue guiding Rawlsian analytic theory is how to deal with a plurality of incompatible yet reasonable doctrines. The added qualifier of reasonable is the most outwardly glaring difference between Rawls and Feyerabend's views of pluralism. Rawls describes reasonable persons as those who have realized their two moral powers to a degree sufficient to be free and equal citizens in a constitutional regime, and who have an enduring desire to honor fair terms of cooperation and to be fully cooperating members of society. Reasonable pluralism, then, means a pluralistic society made up of reasonable people. Feyerabend, by contrast, defends what many would consider unreasonable doctrines, such as astrology and voodoo. In positing that we protect unreasonable views, Feyerabend does not endorse them, but embodies Mill's argument that questionable opinions still contribute epistemic value to society. It is worth noting that even under these conditions, Rawls still thinks certain topics cannot come into the discussion. Feyerabend's view of pluralism also has something similar to a reasonability requirement. Jamie Shaw puts forward a pluralist interpretation of Feyerabend where anything goes is the conclusion of his endorsement of the principles of proliferation and tenacity. The principle of tenacity specifically suggests first that we select from a number of theories the one that has the most attractive features and that promises to lead to the most fruitful results, and second, that we stick to this theory despite considerable difficulties. Feyerabend describes the principle of tenacity as reasonable because it leads to the development of theory. Tenacity means that theories must be elaborated and become more sophisticated over time. In a sense, the purpose of tenacity is to make the theory gradually more acceptable to more people. This is a similar impulse towards setting down conditions for agreement that we see in Rawls's own reasonability qualifier. Therefore, the addition of reasonability alone is not necessarily the core of their differences. Pluralism operates differently in Rawls and Feyerabend's thoughts because they disagree on what kinds of things people can agree about and what value that agreement has. In other words, they disagree on the capacity for and point of toleration in a pluralistic society. This understanding of pluralism and agreement underlines the point of departure between their views, particularly because Rawls uses the potential for agreement as the guiding force behind the justification of his theory. Rawls doubts the likelihood of reaching rational agreement among moral, religious, or philosophical doctrines. To devise a public conception of justice, we apply the principle of toleration to philosophy itself and make only political, not metaphysical claims. It is not up to the people themselves to tolerate each other's conflicting comprehensive doctrines, but instead those doctrines are removed from the picture. Rawls proposes a way of theorizing about political life that can deal with what he sees as the insurmountable elements of pluralism without using state coercion to get rid of difference entirely. Feyerabend differs on the positive potential for toleration and agreement given conditions of pluralism. For him, a plurality of potentially incompatible views can lead to achievement and progress. Each position must tolerate the others. That is the core of epistemological anarchy. The very process of society engaging with that potential incompatibility between a plurality of different viewpoints leads to progress. The key difference here is that Feyerabend sees pluralism as worth protecting because of its value, while Rawls sees pluralism as worth protecting because it could not be eradicated without the use of state coercion. Feyerabend's epistemological pluralism makes truth the far-off aim of inquiry, whereas the fact of reasonable pluralism put forth by Rawls sees notions like truth as hindrance to agreement and political justification. While political liberalism avoids concepts because of pluralism, Feyerabend demonstrates that pluralism is not something to fear and argues instead that it can positively improve our epistemic understanding. A potential response would be that this comparison misses the point because the relevant discussion of truth in Rawlsian analytic theory are conceptual, not methodological. But the denial of truth has two significant methodological implications that Feyerabend's epistemological anarchism brings to light. First, there is a parallel problem between the outright dismissal of truth by Rawls and the arrogant claims to possess the universal truth that Feyerabend targets. Second, even if the avoidance of truth is posited as conceptual, it still restricts the method Rawls and those who follow him use and dismisses its potential. For Rawls, toleration within pluralistic societies does not mean that anything goes, but instead it suggests that any truth claim does not go, which has a similar result to the predicament of the rationalist according to Feyerabend. Rawls's view of pluralism requires making a distinction between the private and public spheres to direct inquiry to purely political considerations. Questions that bear on moral, religious, and philosophical doctrines are relegated to the private sphere and deemed not relevant for the political type of consensus grounded on reason that constitutes Rawlsian analytic theory. By asserting that truth claims have no role to play in political theorizing, it precludes contributions relevant to these topics. This almost dogmatic dismissal of truth and related concepts operates as a universal standard, creating similar issues to those Feyerabend charged against scientific methods that claim to possess the universal truth. The ironic result under Feyerabend's view is that sidelining disagreement over conflicting truth claims from political theory restricts the potential to reach agreements that are themselves true, or at least closer to the truth. Even though it recognizes pluralism to a certain extent, what Rawls does by narrowing the acceptable range of topics is akin to entrenching a single universal method. Feyerabend demonstrates an alternative way to accommodate pluralism without Rawls's avoidance that we can extend to political theory. Truth can still be the aim of theorizing, not despite a plurality of conflicting views, but because of the epistemic value of discussion and debate within that plurality. Following Mill's argument for protecting a marketplace of ideas in which many views are explored and the best prevail, Feyerabend argues against any single method because of pluralism's epistemic potential. This view comes in complete contrast to Rawls, who sees pluralism as a condition that precludes discussion of truth to ever justify political principles. Truth should not be abstained from, even when theorizing about politics. Political theory directly studies pluralistic societies and their political dimensions. Therefore, understanding, agreement, and political decisions are made amongst conditions of pluralism and varying claims to truth, including whether there is something especially truth-conductive about pluralistic decision-making, should be of great relevance to political theorists. Some work in political theory is already asking these questions. The epistemic turn in democratic theory accepts that democratic societies are pluralistic, but maintains that democratic deliberation can still produce better or worse answers to at least some political questions. Feminist theory has also brought attention to similar ideas about the situatedness of knowledge, such as Patricia Hill Collins' Black feminist epistemology, which shows how Black feminist thought can bring society forward by contributing to a web of diverse perspectives. To conclude, truth has a bad reputation in political theory. This presentation attempted to refute the method of avoidance, otherwise known as epistemic abstinence in Rawlsian political liberalism, which has been widely accepted in the field more generally. Accepting Rawls's premise that the task of political theory is to theorize against the background of reasonable pluralism, I found fault with the assumption that the fact of reasonable pluralism necessitates avoiding topics that may elicit disagreement to reach collective agreement about political concepts. Feyerabend demonstrates a way to think about pluralism, not as a condition that makes truth antithetical to a successful method of inquiry, but instead a way of viewing pluralism as something that leads to progress. To protect theorizing from what he considers to be the most difficult to agree upon topics in a pluralistic society, Rawls misses out on the full epistemic potential of pluralism. Reviewing Rawls's epistemically abstinent view in light of Feyerabend's insights reveals the complicated and positive interaction between truth and pluralism. Thank you.
All right, very nice talk here. I see Ian and Jamie. So Ian?
Cool, thanks Juliet. I thought that was great. A question about one feature of Rawls's account that you didn't mention, which is the public reason ideal. Now, I think Rawls was trying to do something impossible in wanting a conception of public reason that's neutral with respect to comprehensive doctrines, because public reason needs some content. And the reason one way to connect this to Feyerabend is to consider the way that Philip Kitcher tries to develop the notion of public reason by insisting that it must be filled with scientific content. And I wonder if Feyerabend would say two things to that. One, that's clearly not a neutral conception of public reason because you plugged it into the sciences. But also, if you want to have a notion of public reason that's grounded in the sciences, you're screwed because there's no one thing called the sciences that you can plug public reason into. And so I wonder where that kind of Feyerabendian worry about public reason, either in the Kitcher form or the Rawls form, would fit into your account.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you. I think at least the account so far is at least started as a methodological intervention. So it was focused more on Rawls's kind of negligence of comprehensive doctrines when it comes to justifying political principles. But I think I would hope to extend it to his view on public reason, because I think that probably has the most important bearing on kind of what political theorists are doing now, or what we see in actual societies, if we say that when we are debating in a pluralistic society, we have to just set aside all these topics that we can't agree on. That seems wrong, and many people have criticized Rawls on that ground. I think the connection between public reason and science, it came out in, I'm trying to remember whose presentation on Thursday, but someone brought up Zeynep Pamuk's work on expertise and democracy, and I feel like that has a very interesting, like there's lots of interesting work being done on where science and expertise fits into public reason. But yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
Jamie?
Cool. Thank you so much, Juliet. Really awesome paper, really cool stuff to think about. First is more of a comment. There's a paper coming out in a volume that John and I are editing by Kathleen Okrulik that deals with basically all of the topics in the paper, Mill, Feyerabend, truth, and kind of engages with Elizabeth Lloyd's paper on that too. So that paper might be really helpful once it comes out. And another paper that's kind of older, but still might be helpful when thinking about the relationship between Rawls and Feyerabend on the reasonableness qualifier, which, by the way, I really, really enjoyed that part of the talk. But the old paper is by Andrew Lugg called Feyerabend's Rationalism, which might be helpful as well. So my question, I think, is a fairly small one. But one thing I kind of wasn't sure about during the talk is about whether truth abstinence is referring to some kind of, theoretical sense of truth or philosophical sense of truth, or like kind of truth talk, like people contributing to public debate, or even like, official state documents or something like that that use the language of truth as kind of a rhetorical ploy, or or maybe they sincerely believe it, whatever. It seems like that if you're being more pragmatically oriented, as Rawls seems to be, then ultimately you want to be interested with these individual cases of kind of truth talk sort of thing, which seems distinct from like these more philosophical questions about the role of truth in like political theory. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit to that.
No, that's a great question. I think the short answer to that is that it's kind of both, but more so the latter, being the truth talk, because Rawls explicitly says, I don't take a stand on the actual status of truth. Like, I am not going to argue whether there is something that is truth, or among these positions there might be a true one. Like, I'm not going to intervene on that. So it's more about when we are engaging in public reason or theorizing, it's the certain concepts that just by being let into the room, he thinks will kind of inhibit agreement from happening. So I think that, practically speaking, is more the second kind of truth talk plane, but I think they kind of they overlap in certain ways.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Matt. Oh, you're muted, Matt. Even though you unmuted. Oh, I hear you. Oh, you're coming in really staticky, and I don't think I'm hearing anything. Yeah, I don't think we heard anything. So maybe, can you type something in the chat? Thanks, Matt. And Marco, we can come to you.
Thank you. This was really. I have a general question. Sound a little. The crankiness is not directed to you, but I'm just really interested in what you have to say about this issue. The impression, and again, as an outsider when it comes to Feyerabend, but as a philosopher of science, my impression that pluralism has now become pretty much the standard. Everyone talks about pluralism. To the point that I am having a hard time now seeing what the polemical target is. So what's, what really is the alternative? Like, what does it mean to reject pluralism? What are we arguing for? Pluralism. And the feeling I get, and this is why I myself am attracted to Feyerabend to begin with, because it seemed to me that he kind of showed what it means to take some of these ideas to the extreme, and it shows that actually they take us down a rabbit hole. But can you say a little bit more about not what pluralism is not, or what, in other words, what reject the pluralism view, how you conceive.
I feel like some of that was cutting out for me, so I'm not sure I got the whole question. But you have a problem with pluralism is the general gist I got. But the very last thing you said was cut out.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's like I can hear most of what you say, but some of it's cutting out. I don't know if it's on my end or if that's for everyone.
Yeah, I think it's just coming in a bit quiet, Marco. But yeah, I think I heard something like you were a bit confused about, well, what's the motivation of pluralism? And I also missed the last part where you said something, you gave a kind of contrast. So maybe repeat that last bit for Juliet.
I guess, can you hear me better now if I speak a little louder?
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to get a sense of what it would mean to reject pluralism, because Feyerabend, I think, took this to the extreme. He showed us what the consequences, the real consequences, I think, of a pluralistic worldview is. But I'm at the point where I because everyone seems to be on board with this sort of pluralism, and this may be a good thing, but it's not clear to me what the polemical target is. What are we rejecting exactly when we propose a pluralistic stance? What is the alternative to pluralism in today's day and age?
Yeah. Okay. That all came out clear, and that's a great question. I guess there's two answers. One is the philosophy of science answer, and one is the political philosophy answer. And I think I have the expertise to do the latter, and the answer is easier. Pluralism just is democracy in a certain way. So the alternative would be like an autocratic regime where there isn't a plurality of ideas because there is one state truth, or like people aren't allowed to discuss and debate different perspectives. So I think that almost thinking about Feyerabend and pluralism in science in kind of society, like in the political domain, trying to transfer it to society, it almost makes the concept make more sense for me, because it's just like kind of a background condition, at least for politics. But I don't think I'm equipped to answer the science question, which I think might be what you're really getting at. But I apologize for that.
Matt, is your comment complete here in the chat? Oh, yes. Okay, let me read out Matt's question. So he says, Juliet, wonderful talk on Zainab Pamuk's book. It's interesting to note that she has dueling epigraphs, one famous quote by Hardwig on the epistemic dependence on deferral to experts, and another from Feyerabend's Science in a Free Society saying basically the opposite. My question is whether a pragmatist about truth would be a helpful supplement here. And he says, compared to Shalom Isaac's pragmatism and Robert Tallis on truth inquiry in moral political context. Rawls clearly has some metaphysically weighty correspondence notion of truth when he rejects that.
Yeah. Okay. On the Zainab question, she actually is one of my professors at Oxford and is the one who showed me Feyerabend. So actually, we didn't read any Hardwig, but she was a big fan of Feyerabend when I was taught by her. So I don't know if that says anything about her position, but she actually shared this conference with me and told me to submit because she knew I was working on this paper. So I owe Zainab for why I'm here in the first place. And then the second question about pragmatist views of truth, that's actually very interesting because in previous work I've done on lying and falsehood in democracy, I've relied primarily on John Dewey's view of experimentation in democracy and where truth comes into that. which it doesn't come super explicitly through Dewey, but I think kind of taking that pragmatist view, at least that's something I do in other places, haven't thought about it in relation to Feyerabend, but if I have any coherence in my own thought, then there might be a connection, since I do like Talise's work also. I've read a lot of, so yeah, it's very, and then the last part of Estlin. Yeah,
this is Jordy's edition. Estlin's emphasis on truth is outweighed by considerations of quality of decision outcomes.
Yeah, I think so. Estlin, that's just like complicated, maybe opening a can of worms, but there is interesting debates on kind of epistemic theories of democracy, whether the outcome is true or good or right, and that's a whole other thing, but yeah.
Lucas? I think you're muted.
Yeah, it just takes forever whenever I click a button for it to actually like do the thing. Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about like procedural liberalism, and it seems like in a certain sense. So I think like to go back to like Marco's question, like we're rejecting is any kind of like political philosophy that assumes that there's such a thing as like an objective truth of the situation, which coming from a Marxist background, I can tell you it does exist. Like, you know, there are people who think that way. But then there's for people like you know, like Rawls, and like going back to a conversation that I think we're having with Eric yesterday in a Q&A, even if he's not thinking about science, he's always interested in being scientific. I think that was something that Eric was saying yesterday. And so I think that reflects a concern with method is a bad word in this context, but with the procedure through which you arrive at certain things, right? So even if you know, we don't have a kind of external barometer by which, and this goes back to the pragmatism stuff, by which we can like appeal to like ultimately adjudicate stuff. There is something about the integrity of the process itself, right, that can guarantee the reasonableness, right, or scientificity of a certain kind of outcome or something like that, right? So that's a way in which we can kind of compatibilize the kind of like political stuff with a kind of non-methodist, right, approach to understanding the way science actually functions. Just a comment, I guess. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, no, that's a great comment. It kind of reminds me of Jürgen Habermas and his kind of adoptions of democratic deliberation to make it more procedural, but also kind of have this epistemic bent.
All right, very good. Let's give Juliet a hand.
All right, thanks, Jonathan, and thanks to all of you for sticking around for the fourth of these days. So the topic of this talk is historical contingency as a theme in Feyerabend's writings. I think a very important but a very neglected theme. Important partly because I think contingency reflects lots of other themes that are deep into Feyerabend's thinking, including pluralism and this theme of epistemic humility. I think one of the interesting things Feyerabend can contribute is new ways of thinking about the significance of the historical contingency of the sciences. Two problems with this. First, Feyerabend makes lots of remarks about contingency, but they are scattered throughout his work. They're often very unsystematic. They're not always very well developed. He sometimes uses contingency claims to make radical hyperbolic claims. I'm thinking of examples from Science in a Free Society. And also he uses contingency claims to make very different sort of points in different contexts. Second, there's very little discussion of Feyerabend's remarks on contingency amongst those philosophers of science who do talk about contingency. So Ian Hacking, Hans-Jörg Reinberger, they do comment on contingency as a theme in Feyerabend's writings, but they don't really say very, very much about it. So a lot of what follows here is going to be a reconstruction, a rational reconstruction, if I dare say that, of what Feyerabend has to say about contingency. Now, I'll start with a quick introduction to the contingency debate. Contingency has actually been a very interesting theme in many different areas of academic science studies. So it's a theme of a lot of feminist studies of science. Feminist philosophers invite us to imagine what the sciences would have looked like if they hadn't developed under such patriarchal conditions. Some of the radical social constructionists of the 70s and 80s made very radical claims about the social contingency of the sciences. Richard Rorty, for example, indulges in that. Many post-colonial science and technology scholars also emphasize the role of historical contingencies like the European colonial projects in the formation of the modern sciences, and they invite us to imagine how the sciences might have developed if they hadn't been tied to these aggressive projects of European imperialism. And there's also a lot of contingentist claims in the later work of Heidegger and also of Husserl. But it took quite a while for contingency to become a theme in what we might call mainstream history and philosophy of science. A lot of that debate began in the late 1990s, particularly with a famous paper by Ian Hacking, which asked whether the results of successful scientific inquiry are inevitable or contingent. So very crudely, if we replayed the history of science from the start, would we inevitably end up at a genic biology, an oxygenic chemistry, and so on? Or could we have had very, very different scientific results? And if you want excellent overviews of those debates about contingency, there's some great work by Katerina Kinzel and Lena Sola. Now, two big questions in the contingency debate are, first, what are the objects of contingency claims? When we say that science is contingent, what exactly do we mean? There's a whole variety of objects with different definitional specificity. What's contingent might be a certain concept, a certain scientific method or practice, certain disciplinary arrangements, metaphysical commitments, use of certain instruments. You can choose as big or as small an object as you like. And also, what's the significance of these contingency claims? I mean, when you point out to some people that the sciences are historically contingent, they'll shrug and they don't see anything of interest. But we have to say, what is it that's significant about contingency claims? Why would it matter at all to us that the sciences are shaped by historical contingencies? And philosophers of science have given different kinds of answers, usually of a epistemological or a historiographical kind. So if you're Hassett Chang, you think that contingency matters because it can help us to identify putative alternatives to the actual sciences that we did develop and inherit. And in Hassett's famous case study, we could have inherited a phlogistonic chemistry, and this might not have been the disaster that many people would assume. For someone like Howard Sankey, contingency has implications for scientific realism. There is no automatic movement from pointing out that the sciences are shaped by historical contingencies to a rejection of scientific realism, but you can use contingency considerations to at least challenge certain kinds of scientific realism. Or if you're someone like Gregory Radic, the historian of biology, you can use contingency to try to revise our historiographical sensibilities, in particular by weakening the grip of a certain kind of inevitablist assumption, the assumption that, well, however science goes, it will inevitably converge upon certain theories, which Greg thinks, for a variety of reasons, is very invidious. Now, I think that Feyerabend was interested in contingency claims for all of these reasons, all of the above, epistemologically and historiographically. What's interested me recently is Feyerabend's narratives about the deep contingency of what he variously calls the scientific worldview, the rise of rationalism, the Western sciences, etc. And in a couple of recent papers, I've suggested that the conquest of abundance narrative is partly designed strategically to induce a deep sense of the contingency of what have come to be our inherited epistemic and cultural traditions and practices. For example, in Conquest, he talks about the role of idiosyncratic historical development, which enabled the emergence and the entrenchment of what we know as the scientific enterprise. But also we know, thanks to work by Eric and Helmut Haidt, that this was a theme already of philosophy of nature way back in the early 70s. So Feyerabend says that the aim of Philosophy of Nature, the book, is to understand the contingencies that help the modern scientific endeavor to succeed. So I think contingency is a big theme. It's there in Feyerabend's work. He talks about the micro contingencies of practices and the macro contingency of the Western sciences themselves. And what I want to do here is just to sketch for you a way of thinking that will connect contingency, pluralism, and humility. I'm only going to sketch these connections here, because I think they're fairly complicated, but at least I want to make plausible that contingency is a big theme in Feyerabend. It's related to important themes in his work, like pluralism and humility, and that it's worth taking seriously. And I'll start with some remarks upon the connection of pluralism, proliferation, and contingency. Every time I mention pluralism and proliferation, take a shot, and we can play the Feyerabend drinking game. So how would contingency relate to Feyerabend's pluralism? Well, here's one argument based upon Eric's pluralistic test model interpretation set out in his 2006 book. Here is for Eric an insultingly simple summary of the main claims there. Criticism plays essential epistemic roles in scientific inquiry. Criticism is more effective when it uses alternatives, and in particular radical alternatives, genuinely different to the theories you're using. And these alternatives, if they don't naturally exist, will have to be created through processes of proliferation. This is Feyerabend 101. I don't think anyone will disagree with this. So how does this connect to contingency? Well, at least in two ways. First, contingency will affect the possible emergence of certain alternatives. It's an obvious fact historically that certain alternatives either don't emerge or can't emerge due to all sorts of contingent historical events and developments, or including events and developments that didn't happen and didn't develop. For example, social, historical, material, political contingencies will affect, among other things, the kinds of ideas that are favoured at a certain time, the kinds of theories that can be regarded as intelligible, the possibilities for cross-fertilisation across different scientific disciplines, the availability of certain investigative methods, technologies, materials and resources. All of these things are shaped by a whole variety of contingencies, and these can have non-trivial implications for the possibility of certain alternatives developing. To take just one example, which someone mentioned, I think, yesterday, just think of the significant effect of David Bohm's political exile to Brazil on the development of quantum theory. If Bohm had been allowed to stay in the United States, then the whole subsequent history of quantum theory could have been extremely different had he not been in exile and isolated from what was then the mainstream of physics. So there's one thing that contingency can affect. It can affect the possibility of certain alternatives actually emerging, developing, and becoming entrenched. Second, contingencies can also affect the possibility of proliferation. Now, again, it's obvious that successful proliferation requires a lot of things: time, resources, personnel, money, institutional support, genial social epistemic conditions, effective philosophies of science. But again, all of these things will be available or not, depending on a range of contingencies. So the contingencies that are at work in our history will shape the possibilities for proliferation, whether proliferation can occur, what kinds of proliferation, how intensive or extensive proliferation can be. And I think this is one of the points that Feyerabend wants to make with the Galileo case study. You know, what he describes there in the early chapters of Against Method is a whole series of contingent conditions that were in place that allowed certain kinds of proliferation at that time, including certain natural interpretations, astronomic observations, inherited bodies of knowledge, the availability of certain paradigmatic cases, social conditions that enable certain kinds of rhetorical tricks to work. If all of these things are in place, they enable certain kinds of possibilities. But if contingencies had shuffled the sorts of epistemic possibilities that were available, certain kinds of proliferation would or wouldn't have been available. And again, the rhetoric that Feyerabend uses here is something like, there is a complex pattern of events, there is historical grounding, there are tendencies, attitudes and considerations, persons, relationships, etc. Now, none of this is to deny that decisions and deliberations don't play a role. We're not turning the whole thing over to aimless historical contingencies. The important point here is that scientists do deliberate and make decisions, but they do so within a social epistemic context whose structure, content, and developmental possibilities are going to be significantly shaped by systems of historical contingencies at varying levels of depth. I mean, one example I've thought about recently, think about how successful Francis Bacon was in removing teleological conceptions of nature from the developing European sciences. Now, this wasn't because Bacon discovered that there are no teleological structures in nature. It's because he recognized that belief in them was an obstacle to the technological manipulation of the natural world. After Bacon, it was extremely difficult to take teleology seriously. I was talking to philosophers of biology 2 weeks ago. It's still very difficult to take teleology seriously. But if Bacon had died much earlier and hadn't managed to expel teleology, then other developmental possibilities would have come into view. And I think that one of Feyerabend's background convictions is a sense that our scientific inheritance, or what came to be our scientific inheritance, incorporates certain kinds of epistemic possibilities, but not others, even if some of those occluded possibilities could still be retrieved. So here, think about the criticism of the consistency condition, but kind of upscale it to the level of a whole scientific tradition. One of the things wrong with the consistency condition isn't just that it imposes conservative conformity to preceding theories, it also entraps us in what could have been a very historically contingent developmental pathway. And this is the sort of thing that Hassett Chang wants to develop. Let's not just study how the sciences did develop, but try to imagine, partly through counterfactual reasoning, how the sciences could have developed. And of course, for Feyerabend, as for people like Chang and Radek, the significance of contingency is going to be denied or disguised by all kinds of entrenched methodological and historiographical assumptions, like a presumptive commitment to epistemic monism. Well, there can only be one true theory, and we've got a theory that might be true, so why would we look for contingent alternatives? There's also that commitment to a sort of inevitabilistic triumphalism. Only plausible theories will win out, and certain kinds of Whiggish tendencies, etc., etc. And again, we could rethink the famous anything goes slogan that we've heard so much about. One of the ways to interpret this is, what else might have gone if historically contingent conditions could have obtained? So we can ask, of course, many things go, sure, but there are lots of ways that science could have gone that they didn't go, but not because those directions were futile or doomed to failure. The fact is that we simply don't know how the sciences could have developed if these contingent conditions had been very different. And this is where I want to get to the next theme of humility. So this is section 4. Now, a lot of people who will talk about contingency and defend pluralism try to connect this to epistemic humility. So Hassett Chang is a very, very good example of this. Less exalted, I've tried to make noises in this direction. And I think that there's a sort of contingency-inflected pluralism that's there in Feyerabend. And I think that he associates this with a kind of epistemic humility. And again, I think we can use Eric's account of the pluralistic test model to try to draw out this theme of contingentist humility. So here's a simple version of an argument that's been developed by my Durham colleague David Cooper, which I think is also latent in Feyerabend. So the first point is very obvious. The emergence and the entrenchment of the sciences as we know them owe to a complex set of contingencies, a historical grounding, a process, which Feyerabend says is more complex and more conjectural than people tend to realize. I take it no one would disagree with that, unless you're some kind of Hegelian for whom the development of the sciences is ordained by reason. Any Hegelians, please raise your hand now. Second point, which is more Feyerabendian, is that what came to be our scientific inheritance wasn't the result of careful deliberation and decision informed by robust competition amongst a plurality of well-developed alternatives. I mean, there were alternatives and there was critical competition, but it wasn't like we've inherited scientific systems that have been systematically working all the time to identify and develop the full range of alternative theoretical possibilities, to place them in sustained critical competition with one another, and then on that basis to identify which ones can really show their strength. Now, Feyerabend often made this point, but sometimes in a slightly overdramatic way, would you believe it? He says, for example, that the triumph of theories depends on historical conditions, not a critical study of alternatives. He points out that ideas are often rejected before they can show their strength, that certain theories become established, not because they're better, but simply because they arrived earlier and so found it easier to assemble successes in their favor. And again, we can think here about the pluralistic test model on a larger scale. It's practically never the case that we've systematically explored the full range of epistemic possibilities, invested fairly and equally in all of them, brought all of these theories up to a full level of sophistication, and then placed them into sustained critical competition. There are just far too many contingencies at work for this to take place, and anyway, not nearly enough resources. And the way that this gets us towards humility is by pointing out two features. First of all, these competitions that Feyerabend has in mind, they can't be staged ex post facto. You know, for example, many of these rival theories never emerged, but we shouldn't assume that their failure to emerge and become entrenched was because they are intrinsically inferior, assuming triumphalistically that, well, the theories that did emerge were always going to emerge, and if a theory didn't emerge, it must have been no good. I mean, how could we know this? As Cooper points out, it's arrogant preemption to assume that these other theories could never have flown. So we can't stage these competitions if they didn't occur. Second, we can't simulate these critical competitions. We can't sit down from the armchairs and try to imagine whole other alternative ways that the sciences could have developed and then mentally simulate or model how these sciences could have gone. For the very obvious Feyerabendian reason that the direction and the outcomes of anarchistic science cannot be rationally modeled or simulated. So as Emiliano Trizio says, the complexity of inquiry and its collective character precludes any private reconstruction of the entire edifice of knowledge. Or as John Preston puts it in his book, these sorts of trials have never been staged and we cannot even anticipate their outcome. Now, the upshot of this, to quote Eric, is that we cannot make any final assertions of the superiority of the scientific theories and traditions that we inherited. We could only make those final assertions if they had been confronted by alternatives, subjected to critical competition, and forced to prove their theoretical and empirical merits through sustained, robust competition. And as Feyerabend puts it in a very nice phrase, assertions without actual tests have all the success of a maneuver carried out in a void. And I think that this fosters at least two kinds of kind of Feyerabend flavored epistemic humility. First, we should have a greater appreciation of the role of these contingencies in shaping what has come to be our scientific inheritance. We don't need to deny any role for deliberation and criticism. It has taken place. Bad theories are identified and they are removed theoretically and empirically. However, there's much more contingency at work in shaping the development of the sciences than we're often accustomed to appreciate. And the important point here is that the scientific inheritance that we've had could have been extremely different, or at least we are not in an epistemic position to deny confidently that it could have been very, very different. I mean, maybe if we look back at the sciences, we would find it extremely difficult to imagine how could you not arrive at a genic biology? How could you not arrive at an oxygenic chemistry? How could things have been different? But one way to reply is to point out that suppose the sciences had developed very differently, people would have reasoned exactly the same way for exactly the same reasons that we do. They would have looked back at their history and wondered how it could have been different. In fact, Wittgenstein makes this point in, I think it's in Culture and Value, where he mentions overhearing two students laughing. How ridiculous was it for people to believe that the sun went around the earth? And Wittgenstein says, well, how would it have looked if it was the other way around? It would look exactly the same. And this is a point, of course, recently revived by Kyle Stanford in his account of the problem of unconceived alternatives. There can be unconceived alternatives to existing scientific theories. For the reason that we're not systematically exploring and exhausting the space of epistemic possibilities. And as Kyle has more recently argued, various developments in the sciences actually make it less likely that we're exploring systematically the space of epistemic possibilities, due to problems with funding, the institutionalization of the sciences, tendencies towards epistemic conservatism, and all the sorts of things pointed out by sociologists of science, like, for example, the Big Bang theorists becoming institutionally entrenched, controlling access to telescope time, editing the journals, one of Feyerabend's favorite examples. There are all sorts of factors in the sciences at work that will limit our ability to explore these alternative possibilities. So there's one kind of humility, an appreciation of the deep and ineradicable role of contingencies that are actually limiting our ability to explore and develop the sciences in their fullest extent. Second kind of humility that I think comes out of contingency will be a kind of resistance to unwarrantable dogmatic claims about the superiority or the inevitability of our scientific inheritance. Now, this, of course, is very consistent with Feyerabend's general temperament. He doesn't like dogmatism, he doesn't like arrogance, and he doesn't like people demeaning certain kinds of theories and traditions, including non-scientific ones like astrology, etc. I mean, for example, in the things I've written about his defenses of astrology and acupuncture and voodoo, his point isn't that these things work and should be taken seriously. His point is you're dismissing them without argument and understanding and explanation, and that's unfair. So there is a mechanism for the removal of traditions. You don't have to let everything in. But if you have a strong sense of the contingency of your convictions and your inheritance, that should make you a little more inclined to be tolerant and cautious. In many cases, we just don't know what the alternatives could have been, and we can't stage the competitions that would put us in an epistemic position to make confident assurances. So here, what you get out of a kind of a contingency are Feyerabendian imperatives. If you can't imagine how your scientific inheritance could have been different, maybe you should try harder. Maybe you should read counterfactual histories. Maybe you should study other traditions. Maybe you should look at the scientific traditions of other cultures. Maybe you should imagine more. Maybe you should read anthropologists. Maybe you should proliferate. Maybe you should try to actively explore and develop these, for example, in the way that Hasek Chang does with the idea of a complementary science. So contingency, I think, is very, very strongly connected to pluralism. And I think that we can strengthen a case for pluralism by plugging in the concept of contingency. And I think that one of the advantages of this is that we can strengthen this theme of epistemic humility that's so attractive in Feyerabend, because a strong contingentist sensibility will remind us all the time things could have been very different. There's nothing necessarily privileged about the processes that led us to develop these kinds of sciences in these kinds of ways. There can be alternatives that never emerged, but for no good reason. There just wasn't enough money. And so we should imagine, we should proliferate, we should be epistemically humble, and we should cultivate a much more pluralistic science. And if I'm right, these would all be quite deep themes built into Feyerabend, in ways that might actually teach us something quite interesting about the ways that he wants to connect epistemic virtues, contingency, pluralism, sensitivity towards other cultures, and cultivating more historicist sensibility in the philosophy of science. And I'll finish then. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. Questions for Ian? Yeah, Juliet, go ahead.
Yeah, this isn't so much of a question, but while you were talking, it reminded me of a passage from Mill and Liberty, and I'm just curious how and whether Feyerabend would have been inspired or compelled by this, because I think it both agrees with this contingency picture, but also complicates it in a certain interesting way. So I'll just read like part of it. The real advantage which truth has consists in this, that when an opinion is true, it may be extinguished once, twice, or many times, but in the course of ages, there will generally be found persons to rediscover it until some one of its reappearances falls on a time when from favorable circumstances it escapes persecution until it has made such head as to withstand all subsequent attempts to suppress it. And I feel like that kind of idea, that like any truth or idea needs like the right context to really flourish, is in line with your image. But also it seems to say that there are some things that maybe show up contingently but have like some basis to them.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. I hadn't thought of it in connection with that. I wonder whether Feyerabend might think that Mill's remark there is too optimistic. I mean, maybe in at least two ways. First, it might be the case that certain true opinions could only ever emerge under contingent conditions, but because they're contingent, they might never obtain more than once. You know, kind of a sort of one-shot truths, like that was the one time it could have happened, and if you missed it, it's not going to repeat. And maybe a second kind of over-optimism is the sense that you cannot extinguish certain of these truths forever. I think, well, actually, in certain cases, you can. One could imagine certain kinds of contingent developments where whole ranges of truths simply become inaccessible. You know, maybe the example of Bacon and teleology is a good example of that. So that was, what, 475 years ago? Those kind of conceptions are still out of reach. They've been so far kind of permanently placed outside of the epistemic imagination. So maybe I would interpret Mill's remarks there more optimistically, but as ways that will be significantly undermined by the kind of deeper contingentist sensibility that Feyerabend wants. You know, what we really need actually, to shift to a different term, is a sense of just how fragile and partial our epistemic inheritance is. You know, we might like to imagine this vast ocean of alternatives, Feyerabend's phrase. Actually, it's really nothing like that at all. It's much smaller, more partial, more confined, and more constrained than we're accustomed to realizing, which again, I think provides an even more urgent argument for pluralism. You know, that the vast ocean of alternatives is evaporating, and it's being drained by all sorts of nasty people. So that's more of a reason to try to cultivate a much more urgent, active pluralism. I also dimly remember some of the Mill scholars criticizing Mill for this idea. Again, I think along similar lines. Mill is just too optimistic, you know, as if the pursuit of these true opinions is like playing whack-a-mole. People can just keep hitting them all the time, but they'll keep popping back up. One response is, well, no, you just destroy the mechanism by which these moles keep popping up, and then there you go. You have extinguished them forever. Yeah.
Just a question of clarification here, Ian. So, I mean, I think this is a nice kind of point about contingency. When I think about it, I really do think about it in terms of his criticism of the consistency condition, because there he's like, you know, this just preserves the status quo. It doesn't preserve the better theory. So it's a pretty straightforward argument. And I took it to be some kind of argument for based on contingency and a kind of historicism about that. But I guess, like, you know, in the Stanford school, their kind of school of pluralism, they're beating on contingency over and over. Where are the main kind of textual sources for Feyerabend's contingency? Because I think you're right. It's going to be this thing where it's kind of scattered and this kind of throwaway comment by him. But what would you view as the kind of most important works for your kind of project here?
If you want the full version, that's in the 2023 paper. That's at the end of the handout. Most of the ones I use, I remember taking from Against Method, the first, second, and third editions, Philosophy of Nature, Conquest of Abundance. There's surprisingly less of it in Farewell to Reason. I expected more. I mean, one thing I would need to check, and maybe Eric can illuminate me on this, is what term Feyerabend is using that he's translating as contingency. One of my German colleagues said it's actually the word idiosyncrasies. That's what he's translating. But they will be the main sources. And sometimes he doesn't explicitly use a term like contingent. He'll use some locution like there could have been other ways. One could imagine. It's very Wittgensteinian. One could imagine a different way. And that becomes, I think, a little more prominent in Conquest, or the things collected as Conquest of Abundance. There's an emphasis on the other ways things could have gone, the unrealized ways that ...
Jordi?
Yes, thanks. I just now want to add a kind of a speculative comment, I assume, if I want to play Hegelian. That there's, yeah, I mean, in a very not frivolous way, which is to say that if you can get some periodization going, it seems clear that the majority of these contingentism flourishes in the late 70s, begins, you know, and then all the way through Conquest. Mm-hmm. But that seems to be both consistent with, at some, you know, more basic, I don't mean reductionistic level, but some very basic broader level, and continues with the kind of a synthesis of two elements that he has going before quite separately. One is the historicism, you know, from the early 60s, and the other is his endorsement first in Popper of the in philosophy of physics, and then in Bohm of indeterminism, right? So indeterminism is key to Popper's, you know, realism to some extent, and his critique of Copenhagen, and then also you have business in Bohm, you know, that becomes not just a matter of, you know, the way the theories are formulated, but also the way in which, one of the things I was emphasizing in my talk, I mean, this pluralism of these realistic conditions, the way he tries to replace the realism conditions in or criterion in EPR with, I mean, Bohm, I mean, with, he said explicitly, a realistic sense of correspondence with reality that is effectively only statistical. So as Feyerabend changes his allegiances from Popper to Bohm, it's still in the background, still the same background commitment to this indeterminism. Within the, of course, within the framework of the law, these are indeterministic laws, right? So there's an element of both, you know, change and necessity, so to speak. But that's in the background. So you have, on the one hand, historicism, so history, not historicism, right, in the 60s, and then you have this contingent, this indeterminism, you know, in the philosophy of physics, and suddenly you have this, you know, historicism, contingentism in the 70s beginning.
Interesting, thanks, Jordi. That's particularly helpful for trying to understand why contingency would be such a continuous but such a submerged theme in Feyerabend's work. There is lots of things feeding into it. I mean, as you say, the historicism, this indeterminism. I take it also kind of Feyerabend's kind of temperamental delight in alternatives and other possibilities and different ways things could have been. I think it's also connected, although I didn't mention it, to a sort of almost a kind of a humanistic sense, that one of the things that's so remarkable and delightful about human beings is that if you leave them alone and give them fairly decent conditions, they'll become abundant and they'll just generate all sorts of new ideas and theories, and they'll fizz in all directions. And I think that also sustains a kind of appreciation he has of contingency, the kind of the wonderful open-endedness of human cultures and human beings, except under the most oppressive conditions. And then later on, I think other things start to kind of feed that sense of contingency. So it's a complex combination of psychological, temperamental, methodological, epistemological, and metaphysical convictions all bubbling away in the background, which feeds something like this deep contingentist sensibility that never quite takes definite form because there are too many things feeding into it.
I mean, I think that the other continuity is from very early on has to do with creativity, artistic creativity, that then becomes part of scientific creativity and discovery, right? So that clearly is an element of, that comes from his, interest in art, of course, and his own, artistic tendencies. So that's very true. I mean, I don't know if you call it metaphysical or what, but
Yes, I think there's a good distinction made in recent work in creativity and science between a kind of creativity that's internal to a certain kind of tradition that's up and running, but also a kind of broader kind of meta creativity, which extends to the formation of new frameworks and things themselves. It's not in the handout, but there's a paper I have on creativity in Feyerabend and Bohm, where I kind of make that point that what really excited Feyerabend was this sort of meta creativity where you generate whole other ways of thinking. And again, one could plug that into a kind of a deep sense of contingency. Well, if these things never came to be for no good reason, then let's put on our Feyerabendian hats and kind of do this kind of creative work of trying to develop them. Although how that would relate to the point Matt made about Feyerabend skepticism about certain kinds of creativity would be a snag.
Eric?
So Ian, wonderful talk. I never find anything to disagree with whenever you give a talk, and I always learn something new. So I really appreciate it.
Let's leave it there.
Just a comment or two, also to do with the discussion, and that is that there's this 1966 paper on dialectical materialism, where he sort of gives a step toward Bohm. And his point there is that he rejected Bohm because he hates his dialectics and all of that. But he admits that Bohm had a point that we start from a position that we don't get to choose, so that the contingencies come with restrictions on the possibilities for development. You see what I'm getting at? So the way that he talks about contingency, for example, is always in his anti-necessity. So that's the reason he rejects Kuhn. That's the reason he rejects Bohm, because they believe in this kind of, he always says in the letters that he uses this famous quote from Hegel, I think, alles Vernunft ist, everything rational is real, and that he rejects this. And this is a theme that comes from very early on, when he says that his first love in philosophy was Dingler, and who had this way of making like science seem like, it's not in it, it is what in itself, but it is what we make it and what we make of it. So I think it goes very, very way back to his, maybe Matteo can say more to that, but somehow it seems to be part of this Vienna tradition in philosophy, of scientific philosophy, that philosophers' jobs are to kind of guide science the right direction, this normative kind of, and also the idea that somehow common sense and the status quo are things that have to be overcome. I think that comes out of that tradition, but Matteo could, or other people could say more to that. But anyway, thanks again. Great talk.
Oh, thanks, Eric. Yes, I think actually the anti-necessity, that might be actually the best way of, I think, expressing what Feyerabend wanted the concept of contingency to do. And would also be consistent with a kind of strategic contingentism, where, whether or not you think there really are these kind of deep contingencies, well, let's act as if there aren't, because that will just dampen so many of our impulses towards creativity, ingenuity, and pluralism. And also, I suppose it would give it a certain political character as well. If you have a constant sense of the contingency of what you've inherited, then you have a sense of its potential changeability. And that will be extremely advantageous for those who are being screwed over by the current kind of inheritance. And that is one point about contingency that I think Rorty does get right. A certain sense of contingency will sustain a certain kind of critical openness. It prevents people from just accepting what's been inherited as a given and as something inevitable. But I'll have a look at the 66 paper and I'll look at the Dingler references as well.
Marco?
Yeah, thank you. This was quite interesting. And I guess more than a question, I have more, I guess, a tangential remark. But I was intrigued when you pointed out that the English translation of contingency may be a bit of an oddball, because I was actually thinking, and again, I come to this as an external reader, not as an insider scholar, but there seems to be a confusion in the use of contingency, because on the one hand, as you pointed out, like there's biologists who talk about the contingency of biology along, or it's, as opposed to its necessity. And I'm thinking of someone like Steve Gould, or more recently John Beatty. But that doesn't seem what's at stake here. What's at stake here, in a sense, is the contingency of the history of science, which taken literally is a truism. I mean, history by definition is contingent as opposed to necessary. But if I understand Feyerabend correctly, the point is not a truism at all. It's the interesting question of whether things could have been gone otherwise and still be quote unquote rational, progressive, and so forth. But contingency doesn't, I mean, to me at least, doesn't seem to capture the core of what's going on. So I guess my question would be like, why not just pick a different term?
Good question. Well, maybe that's one of the reasons that Feyerabend didn't kind of use something like contingency as an explicit bit of terminology. I mean, it is usually either something like contingency or historical idiosyncrasy, or the vaguer references. I mean, I think the dominant sense he wants is that something is contingent if it could have been very, very different. And that seems to be the sense that most excites the contemporary historians and philosophers of science who talk about contingency. So, when, for example, Peter Bowler in his book Darwin Deleted invites us to imagine a world where Darwin never got on the Beagle and, he died when he was walking up the gangplank. It's partly to try to imagine, well, how different could it have been? Would we just inevitably have gone through something like Darwinian biology, just named after someone else? And he suggests, well, no, actually, it could have developed in very different ways. That could have been, in certain respects, scientifically much more effective. And this is what Hassek Chang also does. As Hassek said, it's very boring to say that the sciences could have developed differently. What we really want is interesting, relevant difference. On the story that Hassek wants to tell, in certain respects, the development of the sciences could have been accelerated. Certain connections could have been formed quicker if phlogiston chemistry would have come into prominence. For example, he thinks it would have really helped our development of the understanding of electrodynamics, and it would have advanced in certain ways. Now, of course, that's also the big problem with these contingency claims. They play on counterfactuals, and counterfactuals are famously very, very difficult to assess. But I think those kinds of detailed historical case studies of the sort of the Bowler, Chang, Radix sort, that's what Feyerabend needed, but didn't have, in order to try to motivate his own contingency claims. You can gesture to the idea that things could have been different because human beings in the world are so abundant. But what we really want are relatively robust examples of how they would have been different in ways that would have been preferential or advantageous given what we know. Now, Feyerabend, I don't think, did that. And also, I think at that time anyway, there just wasn't the kind of scholarship you need. I think at that point, people were still locked into E.H. Carr's dismissal of counterfactual history as parlor games with might have beens. I think it's only really in the last 15 years that you start to see the development of very sophisticated counterfactual contingentist alternative histories. So yeah, maybe that's what I would say.
All right, let's give Ian a hand.
Thanks all.
And I think we can go directly into Federico's talk. Are you going to be using slides? No?
No, I'm not going to use it.
Yeah, I'm just going to spotlight you. So our final speaker, so thank you for being our final speaker. Federico Ricalde? Did I miss an accent?
Ricalde.
Ricalde from National Autonomous University of Mexico. So I'll just hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone for your attention and from being here, and thank you for the organizers, for Jonathan, Jamie, and Matthew. What I'm about to present is a work in progress, so I will appreciate all your observations and comments.
And a disclaimer, I must warn that I haven't practiced my English in a long time, really practiced. So it's a bit rusty. In advance, I apologize for any pronunciation errors or maybe grammar errors. I hope everything can be understood as best as possible. So I'm gonna talk about the ontological status. I would like to answer the general question, what's the ontological status of values from the perspective of Feyerabend's late philosophy? So I'm gonna read. So thank you very much. In a text titled What Are Values, published in 1924, the Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset recognized the theoretical and practical concern surrounding values as one of the most profoundly real aspects of the new era. In Ortega y Gasset's words, anyone, I'm quoting, anyone who ignores the meaning and importance of this concern is 100 leagues away from suspecting what is happening today in the deep recesses of contemporary reality, and even further from glimpsing the future that rapidly approaches. Almost 100 years have passed since Ortega y Gasset's words, and we can observe that theoretical and practical concerns about values have not diminished. On the contrary, these concerns are perhaps felt more strongly, particularly in disciplines such as the philosophy of science. Indeed, following criticisms directed at the ideal of value-free science, much philosophical effort has been focused on attempting to construct a new ideal to replace the previous one. Within these proposals, we see an interest in elucidating the role of values in scientific research in such a way that their incorporation does not undermine objectivity. Most of the time, these proposals assume a notion of value without clarifying what values are or explicitly discussing their ontological status. However, as we will see, this issue is of utmost importance, for to some extent, the question of whether values undermine scientific objectivity depends on the definition of their ontological status. For example, whether there are psychological states, properties of goods, what promotes and drives behavior, communal desires, auxiliary motives, maxims, or heuristic rules, what values are affects how their role in scientific practice is conceived. In this regard, in the first part of this exposition, I will offer a brief overview of different theories regarding the ontological status of values. The aim of this is to motivate the recognition that most of these theories start from two assumptions. On the one hand, a distinction between practical and theoretical rationality, and the other, a distinction between the evaluative and the factual. In the second part, I will attempt to show that the notion of reality offered by Feyerabend's late philosophy breaks with these assumptions. Therefore, I believe it could offer a novel response to the question of the ontological status of values. In this sense, in the third part, I will attempt to provide an approach to the following question. What is the ontological status of values according to Feyerabend's metaphysics of abundance? So I will begin for the first part. During the 20th century, the discussion around ontological status of values was primarily framed in terms of their subjective or objective nature. In this sense, we can find families of theories about values with subjectivist, and those that propose intermediate position or aim to overcome this dichotomous discussion. Likewise, 20th century philosophy of science, whether subscribing to the ideal of value-free science or rejecting this ideal, offers, albeit implicitly, different stances on what values are. Due to time constraints, I cannot delve into these positions. I will mainly focus on the objectivist and subjectivist discussion, as it somehow articulates the question of the ontological status of values in classical terms, and I will briefly refer to one position from the philosophy of science. I will begin with the so-called subjectivist positions. According to these views, the values associated with representations, objects, events, or actions are nothing more than the reflection of or projection of subjective need, interest, or desire. In this individualist version, if something has value, it is because someone values it. Therefore, the existence of values depends on this subjective act of valuation. Under this assumption, value judgments would be reduced to a matter of taste or preference. In its collective version, it is not isolated individuals who confers value to things, but a determined community. That is, a collective of individuals who share needs and desires. The relativism inherent in individual subjectivism disappears and is now transferred to the collective level. From an ontological point of view, values are sociological facts that depends on the collective act of valuation. In other words, something is valuable if it tends to satisfy the collective desire. On the other hand, in contrast to subjectivism, we find objectivism. From this perspective, if we value something, it is because it has value, independently of whether anyone values it. Thus, for the objectivist, values are not reducible to mental states, but their mode of being is not the same as the physical entities. Values are conceived as a kind of unreal properties that resides in goods. These value properties bear phenomenological similarities to formal and sensory properties, but they constitute an independent category from the latter. They are objective properties in the sense that, under similar psychological conditions, different individuals would impose the same value judgment. Consequently, value judgments are not reduced to matters of taste or preference, nor to expression of emotions. Rather, they are judgments susceptible to objective validity, that collectively could even form a science of values. For the objectivist, when making a value judgment, we do not evaluate whether a specific object meets a particular quality. Rather, we affirm that the object in question is worthy of it. In this sense, the value judgment is not merely descriptive, but also normative. In summary, subjectivism and objectivism regarding values exemplify different responses to the question of what values are. For subjectivists, values are reflections of mental states that depend on a subjective act of valuation. For objectivists, they are sui generis property that depends on an object called goods. On the one hand, by reducing values to mental states, subjectivists conceive value judgments as matter of taste or preference, making argumentation about values impossible, as it is clear that there is no way to argue against another taste. De gustibus non disputando. On the other hand, by identifying values with unreal but objective properties, the objectivist enables an argumentation about values, but at the cost of associating them with the exercise of an estimative faculty and postulating an entirely new dimension of being, the dimension of value. As can be seen in these theories, the question of the ontological status of values influences how value judgments are conceived. It is also possible to observe a certain pattern in these theoretical approaches, as they are framed under a distinction between the factual and the evaluative on the one hand and the cognitive and the practical on the other. These distinctions are also exemplified in some positions in philosophy of science, for example, in Carnap's theory of linguistic frameworks, whose ontological consequences are developed in empiricism, semantics, and ontology. As is well known, in this text, Carnap established a distinction between internal and external questions to linguistic framework. Internal questions have a theoretical and objective answer based on the internal rules of the framework, while external questions, insofar as the question of the validity of the framework as a whole, are not theoretical in nature, and their resolution appeals to pragmatic values related to the purposes of linguistic framework. Carnap's position exemplifies again the distinction between practical rationality, external questions, and theoretical rationality, internal questions, where the former is governed by instrumental criteria relative to ends, values, while the latter has logical empirical resources to establish answers through a logical objective process. Likewise, this position assumes the idea that a linguistic framework or conceptual framework possesses a closed unity, in which the truth of each element within it can be established unambiguously. Next, I will present Feyerabend's notion of reality within the framework of his metaphysics of abundance. As we will see, Feyerabend's position breaks with these dichotomies, so a novel position regarding the ontological status of values can be expected. There are 2 points that I believe are relevant to understanding the notion of reality that Feyerabend develops in his late philosophy. On the one hand, his rejection of the distinction between existence and belief, that is, between reality and history. On the other hand, his rejection on the notion that traditions constitute a closed unit. I will now develop the first point. One of the most recurring themes in Feyerabend's late philosophy is ontological consequences of recognizing the historicity of knowledge. In this sense, his approach is framed in terms of the following question. I quote, how can information that is the result of idiosyncratic historical changes be about historic independent facts and laws? According to Feyerabend, this question presupposes 2 things: the assumption that science is a cultural practice dependent on historical context in which it develops, and the separability assumption, That is the assumption that what is produced by this practice can be separated and exist independently of its historical context of production. The problem posed by the previous question then can be understood as a questioning of compatibility between these two assumptions. The scientific realist, for example, accepts this assumption and asserts that they are compatible, appealing to a privileged form of rationality inherent in certain cultural practices, like science. By virtue of this scientific rationality, what the scientific practice produces can be detached from its historical origin. Feyerabend disagrees with this answer. To address this, he analyzed the acceptability of the mentioned assumptions. Regarding the assumption of the historicity of scientific knowledge, Feyerabend accepts it. He points out that the historical development of science is not teleological and does not evolve through a series of predetermined states. If it were, we could not explain, for example, how the Greek culture, which had sophisticated mathematical knowledge, did not develop mathematical physics. This means that the community can satisfy the intellectual condition necessary to develop its science in a certain direction and still not change in that direction. In other words, it means that intellectual conditions are not sufficient to determine the direction of historical development of science. As certain material conditions, social, accidental, historical, idiosyncratic, contextual, must also be met. Feyerabend derives an epistemic moral from this. There is no form of argumentation that can by itself generate unanimous agreement. Any such agreement is mediated by material and contextual conditions, by virtue of which the success or failure of a scientific result is assessed. In conclusion, the historicity of scientific knowledge implies that every discovered fact is a fact only from a point of view, that is, for someone or for a we. Consequently, it is a product of the accidents, idiosyncrasies, and history of that point of view. Regarding the second assumption, Feyerabend recognized a metaphysical thesis, the postulation of a world that exists, that a world whose existence is independent of our cognitive activity, that is, of our practices and research methods. Against this assumption, Feyerabend questions, what forms of discovery allow us to assert that we discover is really independent of context and therefore part of the real world? Feyerabend's analysis reveals that no research method is strong enough to deny the reality of entities postulated by other research methods. In other words, the fact that one form of discovery satisfies the separability assumption does not imply that there are no other radical different forms of discovery that also satisfy them. Thus, the acceptance of the separability assumption results in a problem of ontological underdetermination. The mechanisms that allow the acceptance of the existence of atoms do not allow the rejection of the existence of weak gods. In Feyerabend's words, I quote, "The assumption was that existence and belief are different things and that the new dark age for science will not obliterate atoms. Why should the Greek gods, whose dark age is now, be treated differently?" In light of the above, two alternatives arise. Either the separability assumption is affirmed, and thus by separating being from history, a notion of reality that contains all kinds of entities that have been and will postulate is affirmed, or in Feyerabend's words, a reality that separates being and history and yet assumes that being can be grasped by history is for to populate being with all the creatures that have been considered and are still being considered by scientists, prophets, or others. So we can affirm the separability assumption, or the separability assumption is denied, and therefore by rejecting the separation between research method and the entity that this method discovers, the union between reality and history is affirmed. This latter alternative is the one that Feyerabend leans towards. But Feyerabend's choice of the union between reality and history does not only respond to the rejection of a metaphysics in which everything exists all the time. This choice also responds to a principle of tolerance, according to which, if the postulated entities plays a relevant role in the life of a culture, then they indeed exist. Declaring them non-existent would mean considering the form of life that values them as inferior, an attitude we would not have right to adopt. As we will see, this would be confusing the abundant and ineffable being with the reality manifested by a particular approach. Thus, Feyerabend proposes what he calls Aristotle's principles as a criterion of reality. The real is what plays an important role in the type of life one wishes to live. With Aristotle's principle, it seems that a close relationship is obtained between what a culture values, that is, between what plays an important role in its way of life and its reality. Feyerabend rejects the image of reality as a given order of facts to which an order of values is added. Instead, the real is because it is valuable for a cultural way of life. It is clear that from this perspective, the question of the ontological status of values cannot be reduced to traditional answers that posit objectivist or subjectivist stances on values. The former assume the distinction between fact and value, which, as seen, Feyerabend rejects. The latter often reduce values to psychological states, make their existence relative to subjective acts of valuation, which contradicts the value of the real for common life. Finally, Feyerabend's stance on the ontological status of values cannot be identified with a social subjectivism, where what is valuable is what a community considers as such. This stance falls into kind of relativism. Here's where I would like to address the second relevant point for understanding Feyerabend's concept of reality: his rejection of the idea that culture, traditions, conceptual frameworks are defined by a close, well-defined, and are impermeable unit to other cultural approaches and traditions. For Feyerabend, relativism rests on the thesis that conceptual frameworks, traditions, etc., are closed units under a single set of rules. It is only under the assumption that they are completely closed that it makes sense to think, like Carnap, of a distinction between the external and internal, that is, between values and facts. In Feyerabend's words, these disordered conceptions only produce chimeras. And I quote, "Relativizing existence to a single conceptual system that is then closed off from the rest and presented in an ambiguous detail mutilates real traditions and creates chimera." Here, Feyerabend points out two important things. Existence cannot and should not be relative to an individual and closed conceptual framework. Two, the idea that traditions are composed of closed and unambiguous conceptual frameworks is a chimera. To understand the first point, it is necessary to distinguish between reality as manifest reality and reality as an abundant being. The abundance of being implies two things. And here I appreciate a lot of the works of Matthew that help me a lot to understand these things. The abundance of being implies two things. Being is unmanageable in its totality for any singular conceptual framework. In this sense, there is always something that remains ineffable under the perspective of the framework. Two, being responds in different ways, so it may be that a successful methodological approach ceases to be so. When Feyerabend states that existence cannot be relative to an individual conceptual framework, he's asserting that manifest reality cannot be merely given by a simple conceptual framework. It does not depend solely on the projection of the latter, as it results from the favorable interaction between the conceptual framework and being, the abundant being. Moreover, existence cannot be relative to a closed conceptual framework, as it would be inexplicable the possibility of a novel invention, and unintelligible those episodes such as Achilles' offense. Lastly, existence should not be relative to a conceptual framework. This could go against a principle that Feyerabend constantly uses in his argumentation, never making a particular approach the measure of existence. This attitude is adopted by traditions that claim the universality of their conceptual frameworks, which manifest a tyrannical use of their universals. Once it is rejected that the conceptual framework that make up a tradition are closed and unambiguous, the possibility arises of conceiving tradition as an open unit to interactions with other traditions. In other words, the possibility arises that a culture can potentially be any culture. In this sense, Feyerabend's position does not fall into relativism as proposed by social subjectivism. Based on what has been said so far, I will address the question that has motivated my exposition. What is the ontological status of values according to Feyerabend's metaphysics of abundance? As mentioned, Feyerabend's metaphysics of abundance postulates an abundant and ineffable being that responds to the methodological approaches and conceptual frameworks of a tradition or a culture. The result of a favorable response is the manifest reality or ontological niche in which a community lives, following the expression of Matt in his text of 2016. This manifest reality is historical, as it depends on the material condition specific to the context in which the practice that project it developed. Moreover, following Aristotle's principle, the manifest reality reflects what a tradition values, that is, what is relevant to its way of life. With that said, to motivate this approach, I would like to refer to a passage where Feyerabend analyzed the Homeric notion of honor. Feyerabend, after mentioning how Achilles introduced a distinction between honor and the appearance of non-honor, states, interpreted as a stable, well-defined, and unambiguous entity, the Homeric notion of honor did not allow for such a distinction, the distinction between appearance and not appearance. Like other epic stereotypes, it was an aggregate containing individual and collective actions and events. Some of the elements of the aggregate were the role of individual possessing or lacking honor in battle, in the assembly, during internal dissertation, his place at public ceremonies, the spoils and gifts he received when the battle finished, and naturally his behavior on all these occasions. Honor was present when most of the elements of the aggregate were present, absent otherwise. In other part, he also mentions, using modern terms, we may say that archaic honor was not merely a subjective or mental event, but an objective relation between an individual and the society which he belonged. Therefore, as first approach, and I'm working in this, we could say that values are an aggregate of events, individual and collective actions that constitute the projection mechanisms through which a reality in which these values are present manifests. Indeed, Achilles often expressed that this reality does not truly manifest honor. That is, this aggregate of events and activities only gives the appearance of honor. In response to this situation, Achilles proposed to rethink the meaning of honor, for which, and this is a quote from Feyerabend, Achilles produced habits of speech and thought which eventually rise to new and more abstract conceptions of honor, virtue, being. Note also that these analogies that establish a connection with the status quo need not be restricted to concepts in the strictly logical sense, but can include images, associations, feelings, moods, which enter the terms involved and modify their semantic core. Concepts such as justice or beauty, even the concept of number, are constantly being changed in this way. Achilles' attitude exemplifies a responsible attitude toward a manifest reality that does not present the relevant values for the chosen way of life. This exemplifies two other theses of Feyerabend: the subject as sculptor of reality, the sculptor of the reality they want to live, and ethics as the measure of scientific truth. If manifest reality, scientific truth, does not present the relevant values for the chosen way of life, ethics, then the manifest reality becomes apparent for the one who suffers it. This is a motivation for pluralism. Then, by virtue of the fact that traditions are open, another aggregate of activities is developed. That is, another projection mechanism is built. If the being responds favorably so that you result in a successful mechanism, it will allow the projection of a new manifest reality, a reality that presents what is valuable for the kind of way of life one wants to live. So I will pass for some conclusions. The ontological status of values influence the way of value judgments are conceived. In this sense, it is relevant to investigate this status in relation to the questions of whether values influence the process of scientific justification. Classical theories of values often assume dichotomies between facts and values or between theoretical and practical rationality. As a result, the question of the ontological status of values is usually embroiled in the objectivist-subjectivist debate. Given the above, it is important to investigate how the question is addressed from perspectives that do not assume such dichotomies. As I have attempted to show, the metaphysics of abundance that Feyerabend presents in his later philosophy abandons these dichotomies. In response to the question, what is the ontological status of values in Feyerabend's metaphysics of abundance, the following answer has been proposed. Values are an aggregate of events, individual and collective actions that define a mechanism of projection. One could say a causal semantic mechanism, through which a reality in which these values become present is manifested. In this sense, there are relationships between the individual, the community, and what is relevant for the kind of life that the community wants to live. And that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Federico. So any questions? Yeah, Ian.
Cool. Thanks, Federico. A question about what Feyerabend means by abundance. it seems to me that he's very ambivalent about two different meanings. One, he sometimes talks as if abundance is some kind of ontological feature of reality, that reality is diverse in kinds of objects, processes, things. But he also sometimes talks as if abundance is more a feature of human experience. When he praises people who are thoughtful, open-minded, and so on, he seems to suggest that abundance is much more a feature of human beings. And sometimes he also talks as if both of these things are true. The world itself is abundant and complex, and if human beings grow up in nice pluralistic conditions, they'll be abundant and complex as well. And so abundance is a relationship between human beings and the world. And I wonder which of those you're more sympathetic to. Is abundance a feature of the world, or of human beings, or of certain ways of relating to the world that certain human beings and cultures have?
Thank you very much. It's a very good question. I think that maybe it can be both. In some sense, I think that abundance is this kind of ontological property that these ineffable beings have. But this abundance, in some sense, responds also to the abundance of approaches that human beings can have studying this being. I think in some sense, using a frame that I see in Matt's text, abundance promotes abundance in some sense. And I think that this can be possible because abundance is in some sense part of this being. It's an ontological property, but it's also something that comes from all this creativity that can be associated with all the different approaches, all the different methodological approaches to the study of this being. So I think that it's both. Thank you.
I guess when you're thinking about the ontological status of values, and you've kind of presented it as this kind of aggregative, collective kind of attitudes, I guess, why are you not taking kind of values at the group level as kind of basic? And I guess this goes to kind of the purpose of your analysis. Is there, so I don't know how to put this as a question. It's kind of why, because you're kind of like, well, there's individual values that can be subjective, objective, and then we get aggregates of them, and that's what values are. But in science and in societal matters, I mean, I think we tend to just kind of attribute values to the group in some kind of way and take those as basic. So I guess my question is, why are you what's the motivation for kind of thinking about them as kind of collectives of individual kind of values?
Yes, I think that values work like some organizational principle, in some sense, that it organizes actions, events, interpretations, and that's for one side. In this sense, values can be approached to this typical notion of values like some kind of criteria that guide decision. It's some kind of criteria that organize decisions, interpretations, that make some things more important and another things not so important. But I think that this is also again falling to this subjectivist debate, in the sense that if we conceive values only like norms, it's some kind of a psychological entity that we use to a decision. But I think that it's important to emphasize that in Feyerabend's work, I think that this distinction cannot operate. It's an operative. So in this sense, it's important to, yes, see this kind see values like this kind of organization, principle of organization, but also that values are reflected in reality, in the way that reality manifests to us. And this is important because I think that in this sense, we can understand episodes like Achilles, that in the context of his offense, he cannot recognize in all these activities, in all these practices, the kind of value that he would like to be manifested by reality. So in this sense, I think it's interesting to emphasize these other character values, that values are not only these maybe psychological criteria that we use to organize something or to give direction to our decisions, but also that values are in some kind of way manifested in reality. And in this sense, I think that we capture this Feyerabendian idea. But of course, I have to work this more. Thank you very much, Jonathan.
And Matt says he appreciates this is a important kind of question in the literature. This is Matt's book. So he says he's plugging his own book. He says read look at Matt's book on values. But this is a very Matt-centric kind of topic. So if you haven't seen it, Science and Moral Imagination.
Thanks a lot.
And Jordi, you had a comment, or Ian, do you want to come back with a follow-up?
Mine was a different question. I was wondering, Federico, whether the points you just made give us one way to make sense of Feyerabend's hostility towards the destruction of many of the world's so-called traditional cultures. I mean, it seems clear this isn't just a moral argument against the wrongness of cultural destruction, that in some sense kind of reality itself is impoverished when these cultures with their manifest realities are gone. People make parallel arguments about the loss of global linguistic diversity. It's not just morally wrong, it in some sense diminishes the epistemic complexity of the world when we become monocultural. And I wonder whether that's part of what you're thinking as well.
Yes, of course. I think that there's this tyrannic use of universals, no? Tyrannic use of generalization, this kind of use that when sometimes a group think that his conceptual framework is universal in the sense that it can includes all the other conceptual frameworks, or in the sense that these conceptual frameworks can't approach the totality of the abundant things. And in this sense, I think that these tyrannic uses of conceptual frameworks, it impoverished, as you said, the plurality of perspective that we can have towards being. Now, I think that, of course, it impoverished. So I agree with you. It's not only this moral attitude that we don't have to destroy these other kinds of worldviews, but also these worldviews eventually, and this is important to understand that the idea that a culture is potentially every culture, potentially maybe our culture will be used of these other kind of worldviews or manifest the reality that we want to live. So in some sense, if we maintain this plurality, I think that in the long term, it's something benefit for every culture.
There's some other comments here in the chat. So Jordi says, 3 elements: ontic abundance is linked to being, abundance of views and values, and relational abundance of connecting criteria of reality and existence. I'm going to try to cut and paste these for you. Ian, I'm not sure what Ian's agreeing with, but I agree, Federico, and argue for something like your view here. So he's got some references, and maybe Hacking agree. Hutto and Hacking might agree. Only pluralists get the most out of reality. This might be an interesting remark in Conquest, that abundance occurs in history, not in the world. Jordi again, he says, Federico, beyond Ortega, I suggest you take a look at Eduardo Nicol's social phenomenology, and he's saying he was at UNAM. Juliet says, this reminds me of Hannah Arendt a bit on reality coming out of the plurality of political life. Jordi's talking about Leibniz, what epistemic counterpart to Leibniz criterion of ontic perfection of worlds and a political one. Ian's saying this is quite Hegelian. Okay, I'm losing the track here. But there's a nice running kind of commentary here.
Yes,
So
thank you very much. I will take
yeah,
all these comments and keep
yes.
working in
Yeah,
the paper.
wonderful.